Well, welcome everyone. Hope your summer is going well. We're starting a few minutes late, and we have a pretty busy agenda. So why don't we begin with call to order? Can I get an approval of that agenda? Let's see from Mark. Charles.
And I will just quickly note that there is a presentation from the Ontario Digital Strategy that was added to the agenda since the agenda first went out, and so that's from 2:35 to 2:50.
There are, for those in the room, there are paper versions of the agenda behind you that have that updated information. And I would just note Pamela's in Washington in transit, and so if she's on the phone, but if she's not in a position to speak comfortably when we get to the governance working group part of our agenda, we might flip the criteria working group and the governance working group to give her that opportunity. But otherwise, nothing else. Declarations of conflict of interest.
Mine continues.
Mine continues.
Anyone on the phone? And can I get an approval of the previous minutes from our meeting in April?
I have just a question on the minutes.
Sure.
There was an intent to circulate some notes and principles from the architecture discussion, which I don't think I've seen, Christine, unless I missed it.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with you and Curtis on that afterward.
Yeah, so I just note that that's an outstanding item. And with that, I can move the minutes. I think that still would be useful and timely.
Okay. Any other comments on the agenda? Sorry, since you, I got approved. Can I get approval for it then?
Minutes.
For the minutes, sorry, thanks. Elena? Okay. Great. In terms of remarks, it's been a little while since we met. Thank you for recognizing the value in the deferral of our last meeting so that we'd have the MIDP to discuss. And as you've seen, in crafting this agenda, we tried to leave the largest amount of time for an opportunity for a discussion with Sidewalk. They'll do a short presentation, but then afterwards we'll open up to discussion. As I mentioned to panelists, but for the benefit of everyone else, we'll run this. I was thinking about it a little bit like a committee hearing kind of runs, where you go around and each person is given an opportunity to raise whatever questions they have or comments they have for 5 minutes. I'll do my best to keep track of time. If there's still, you kind of get to ask your question up until that end, and there's an opportunity for a response. At least my experience before committee, more or less. And so we'll try to keep with that. And if there's an opportunity for a second round or for further discussion, we'll have the opportunity to do that as well. We won't necessarily go around the table, but I'll just invite people who want to speak when they want to speak to let me know, either through Slido or we're small enough here to just kind of let me know. And we'll proceed with that in the afternoon. The morning, we've got a couple of important issues coming out of the working group's governance and criteria. But before that, turn it over to Christina for the management.
Great. So in discussion with the chair and the vice chair, we had intended to take the management report as read unless there are questions. But we do have Nicole here that can provide a bit more of an update with regard to our consultation process. And I also wanted to draw the group's attention to the note around the Urban Ideas Compendium and the invitation to contribute that Waterfront Toronto has received. So this is an activity that is being led by Tech Reset to try and come up with a place where people can look for other solutions that are happening all around the world, not specific to just Toronto, to help inform their look into the MIDP. So we will hopefully have a presentation at the next meeting to discuss what that is. They're going through a bit of a design charrette over the next little bit, and I just wanted to give you visibility that there will be this opportunity going forward on that matter as well. And with that, if there are other questions, I'm happy to take those. If not, maybe Nicole, you can join us at the table to say a few words about the consultation.
Happy to.
Stay right.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Just quickly, I'm Nicole Sworn. Our firm is leading the public consultation for Waterfront Toronto. This first round of consultation is really focused on helping the public navigate and see the 1,500 pages of the MIDP through the lens of a public steward, that being Waterfront Toronto. We've used the note to reader to organize all of our outreach activities, and so far the process has been well received. We have connected with about 650 people in person. We've had 3 public meetings and 5 pop-ups in public libraries. We have more activities this week. We've done a very interim and high-level synthesis of what we're hearing. I'll do the broad strokes. There's 7 points. I'll just go into detail on the one most relevant to this committee, which has come from the digital discussions. For those who aren't aware, the public meetings have about a half an hour briefing at the front, and then community members go into one of 4 rooms, each focusing on one on volume 1, one on volume 2, one on volume 3, and then one on digital innovation, digital governance, and intellectual property. In broad strokes, and this will be updated after this week, these are the points that our team has put together based on the feedback received. So 12 acres could work, but more than that is an overreach. I would say that the appeal and interest in Sidewalk Lab's innovative use of design and technology is tempered significantly by Sidewalk Lab's proposal to expand well beyond the 12-acre focus of the RFP, which is considered by many who have participated in the meetings to be an overreach. Many felt that the proposal did not make a persuasive case as to why Sidewalk Labs cannot achieve the RFP objectives at Quayside, and if or why proposals at a larger scale are required. So they see huge potential, they also see huge risk. There's a general interest and I would say receptiveness to the innovations in the proposal that deal with built form, mobility, carbon reduction, public realm, and an openness to exploring the use of design and technology to do city building differently. Those same voices are looking for more information to understand how or if these innovations would work at Quayside, why there's a need for new and different governance and management structures, and how they'll be funded in the short and long term, and what impact they'll have on everybody, not just residents at Quayside. Public oversight and fairness is essential. There has been consistently a lack of trust in Sidewalk Labs and its parent Alphabet expressed. That ranges from an outright rejection of Sidewalk Labs as a potential partner, all the way through to a real willingness to consider working with Sidewalk Labs on the condition that they earn public trust. They're looking for Waterfront Toronto to put strong, legally binding conditions in place, along with a fail-safe and clear out clause that gets the public out of the relationship when or if it wanted. A few do say they're comfortable partnering with Sidewalk Labs. Now, in detail on the public, there's need for more detail and a public lens for digital innovations. Many are concerned about the use and collection of digital data, especially by private actors, and the potential for hacks, breaches, racial segregation, and more. Some are more receptive to data collection if it's undertaken or overseen by a public actor, and with a regulatory framework that has the ability to create strong public protections and impose strong penalties on bad actors, while others say there are no conditions under which they would accept sensors or data collection in Quayside. There are others that see potential upsides to the digital innovations and that Toronto could benefit from being a leader in this area, though others say there's not enough information in the draft MIDP for them to feel comfortable with what's being proposed. For example, how and when data is stored, which I know has been the focus of discussion around this table. People who support sharing intellectual property with Sidewalk Labs say Waterfront Toronto should make sure not to undervalue our assets, both land and data, and make sure Canadian companies can still compete globally. Others say Waterfront Toronto should not have an economic incentive to collect and use data about citizens.
Sorry, just one sec. Whoever's on the phone, if you can just mute your line, please.
I think they're in a bathtub.
Sorry, go ahead. It's worth a shot.
Last couple points. There's consistent feedback that the draft MIDP is difficult to navigate and lacks a local context. Many participants have said that due to the 1,500-page submission, it's difficult to get a concise focus on exactly what Sidewalk Labs is proposing, what it's hoping to get out of it, and what it has the ability to actually implement. There are concerns that the draft MIDP isn't more strongly rooted in the local waterfront, Ontario, or Canadian context. Many said it's not clear how citizens will benefit, what the potential harms might be, and what will happen when things fail, since there will always be things that fail with innovations. Lastly, many support the consultation process and they're looking forward to further consultation. They much appreciate the two-stage approach, so they're not being asked to give their to really weigh in heavily on what's being there because they haven't had the time to review the 1,500 pages. And many say that they support Waterfront Toronto's leadership on the consultation. Some question Waterfront Toronto's ability to be objective given your previous working relationship with Sidewalk Labs. For the second round of consultation, we had very specific suggestions that Waterfront Toronto consult the public on a more focused subset of the draft MIDP proposals and organize those proposals according to Waterfront Toronto's objectives and do not consult on those aspects of the proposal that are clearly not going to be supported and do not follow the structure, generally do not follow the structure of the draft MIDP. They don't want to see us going out with the same structure again, volume 1, 2, 3. So that was it. We still have, that has been remarkably consistent across the 3 meetings and the 5 library sessions. It's very normal for this kind of process to have some folks that are unconditionally supported, some folks that are unconditionally against, and the vast majority of people end up falling somewhere in between where, depending on the information they have or the conditions that they think are appropriate, they're somewhere in between. So that's it.
Great. Are there any questions?
Just the population size again, in aggregate, like how many?
It's about 650 people, so we're getting consistently between 150 and 225 at the 3 meetings. And some people come more than once, but at least 20% of the people, 10 to 20% of the people in every meeting say it's the first time they've ever come to any meeting related to Quayside, whether that's hosted by Waterfront Toronto or Sidewalk Labs.
And one more question, the distribution of age range.
We don't collect, there's a good mix. I would say compared to many Toronto consultations that focus on development applications, which it would be an older, middle-aged, middle-class kind of cross-section, we're getting a real range from younger people to older people, lots of different backgrounds, ethnicities. The leadership of Toronto, including some of the folks that are vocally expressing their opinions in a variety of letters, are coming to hear for themselves what's happening. So it has been a really nice and extremely intelligent discussion. We will have much more detail. We have facilitators at every table taking notes, working directly with Waterfront Toronto team members, and you will get a much more detailed report from the digital room. There's a lot of very specific ideas, not just broad stroke kind of policy direction stuff. So
I think the other thing to note too is that all of the sessions on Saturday were actually videotaped and they're going to be available on our YouTube channel. All the materials from all the consultations are already available on our website as well, and then the online consultation is another vehicle for people to be able to give their input at this point.
This looks like it's going really well. I mean, I think I'm just delighted to hear this. When can we expect a report?
we will share the draft summaries of the sessions with all the participants. It's a normal step that we do to confirm that if you were there, that it is an accurate reflection of what happened. Also, we don't produce verbatim transcripts because we don't find them useful to support decision making. So we expect those by the end of next week to be out to all the participants. We just have the meeting tonight, and then we're at the library on the Toronto Reference Library on Thursday. I expect the drafts to be out by the end of the following week, and participants will have a week to review. And if they do suggest that we haven't accurately reflected something, we will go back to the facilitators and the Waterfront Toronto staff to double check. But we do find that that step very helpful. We don't expect to, people can't add new information to that. It's just a documentation of what happened in the meeting.
So we would see after they've edited it.
You can see it at the draft stage, it'll be public. And then if it's at the edited stage, it will, the final stage, you'll also get it.
You mentioned that there was a lot of difficulty in navigating the document and feeling like it was difficult to engage with.
Yeah.
Were there any general suggestions or thoughts around that coming from the public about what would be a better way to do it?
100%. They thought that shorter and more concise that actually kind of narrowed down exactly what Sidewalk wanted to get out of it and what, like, narrowing it down into something that was easier to get your head around what exactly is on the table here would be very helpful. And in fact, that's what we've been planning with Waterfront Toronto since the beginning to do for round 2, to more heavily curate where the public takes a really deeper dive based on guidance from Waterfront Toronto's team, as all of you, as well as the feedback from the public today. So yeah, they see and want a way to have another conversation. Many people do, but they think it needs to be. There are, for example, the work of your committee connects to Volume 1 and Volume 2 and Volume 3, and they're interested in seeing how for example, digital content connects to all aspects of the plans, all aspects of the innovations. The same would go for the partnership. How does that connect to the plans? How does that connect to the innovations? In broad strokes, first timers are going to review the rooms that discuss Volume 1 and Volume 2 because they get their head around the plans and the innovations. People who already know something and have done some research are going to Volume 3 and digital, but everybody is looking for, the Volume 3 and digital folks aren't sure how that connects to the innovations, and the innovations aren't necessarily sure how it connects to the
They might be
business
jumping
plan.
on those right away. 'Cause it's,
Yeah, both sides are. It's influencing how people look at it, and the integration would help people understand it in a more comprehensive way, and probably narrow down where public focus would be most helpful.
Mark, did you have a-
Yeah, just I went to one of the sessions. I just wanted to express my compliments to Nicole and her team that really making sure that all voices are heard. I think it's very clear to people that what they have to say is valuable and will be listened to.
Okay.
I just had a question. I think I saw a tweet that the mayor showed up at one. I was curious if politicians, different levels are showing
Joe
up.
Cressy's been to at least 2, I think.
And Paula Fletcher was there on Saturday, and there's been I don't know. There's probably about 25 Waterfront Toronto staff, 20 or so facilitators, 5 or 6 folks from Sidewalk Labs that are there to listen. The elected officials are also encouraged to listen since they have other forums through which they can voice their opinions, and these are really dedicated to the public.
And our assistant deputy ministers and from the province have been there, as well as there's been federal government staff that have attended.
Yep, and other folks from the province that are, they're coming and saying, I'm here as a citizen, but I also work for whichever ministry. So happy to come back when we're done with a more focus. We'll have pages and pages of stuff from the digital room for you, which hopefully will inform that lens of your deliberations.
Well, thank you very much. Sounds
My
like it's going
pleasure.
really, really well.
I think so. I got it. Thank you for sharing your thought.
my pleasure.
Okay, so if we have nothing else on the management report, then we can move on to the governance working group. And I think Pamela's, I'm told, able to participate now. Okay. All right, if we could just make sure that the volume's loud enough for everyone to hear, I will hand it over to you then.
we're just pulling this up now. So I think there were so we sent out the red line version, or apparently yellow line version of the code of conduct, and a few points that I'll just touch on. So first I'll go to the 1.7. So the duty to act in the best interests of Waterfront Toronto. That was something that there's a lot of concern about. Certainly, the statement saying this duty requires that panel members prioritize Waterfront Toronto over all the persons and other organizations when engaged in panel duties. But we took that line out. We left the line: panel members must always make decisions and act in the best interest of Waterfront Toronto in fulfilling the panel's mandate. So in the discussions with the group, there's a lot of discussion around, is the public interest in Waterfront Toronto's interest? Like, people are sitting on the panel to act in the public interest. And what we are kind of trying to, the balance we're trying to strike with the existing, or with the remaining language, is to kind of say that we are of the opinion that expressing your truly held beliefs is in the best interest of Waterfront Toronto. So saying best interest of Waterfront Toronto does not mean the best commercial interests or the interests that will continue a project. It is critical for us to hear dissenting voices on this panel, or voices that are kind of like acting primarily in support of the public interest, because Waterfront Toronto is the steward of public interest at Waterfront Toronto. So we are kind of feeling that we didn't want to set out like a specific reference to the public interest, again, because that's a bit of a flexible term. We don't want to get into discussions around, is somebody advocating for the best interests of small businesses, small Canadian businesses? Is that in the public interest or not? It's like, we didn't want to get into discussions around that. That's why we kind of just left that out. But we are of the opinion that as long as you're not giving advice that supports an organization or corporation that is that is outside Waterfront Toronto, and you're giving advice solely on behalf of that, or to enrich that organization, then the advice that you're giving is in the best interest of Waterfront Toronto. We also want to flag that this only speaks to activities that take place while you are fulfilling the panel's mandate. So this doesn't speak to any outside activities. So this is really only the advice you're providing at these meetings, reports that may be created about any particular project. So we're not trying to apply this to any academic work or any work that takes place outside of the bounds of when Waterfront Toronto asks you for advice. We want your best advice. That's the panel's mandate. So that's kind of the balance that was trying to be struck there. I don't know if that helps explain that one at all, Pamela, but as I flipped. Yes. So that other point is in 5. So I think it's in 5.2, where we're saying panel members must not make public comments about the panel unless the chair has authorized them to do so. We'd kind of discussed that it is perfectly reasonable for the chair to give a blanket statement to kind of say panel members are authorized to speak about the panel. What we didn't want to do, internally, is that we didn't want to disempower the chair by taking that language out. We kind of wanted to still allow for the chair to make decisions about how the panel is going to be represented. And again, we have to recall this language is meant to apply not just to DSAP but to all panels that have been struck by Waterfront Toronto, including the design review panel. So this is not specific to just the DSAP. So that's why we kind of have left that particular language in. As opposed to just kind of striking it if we assume that the chair is going to simply give a blanket authorization to speak about the panel, make public calls for the panel. That was the rationale for leaving it in.
You don't want to do per tweet provision.
No, there is, with all respect, there's some irony that the chair opposes this particular provision. So the idea that this is empowering the chair when the chair actually would give a blanket statement, and frankly, if we end up there anyway, I don't know why it's in there, because I frankly would not like it. I don't think it's necessary. But anyway.
I think there's a nuance like between purporting to represent the panel as a whole in public and commenting as an individual.
Right.
And I think it's there, but maybe it needs to be a little.
Yeah, and so there's kind of there's it's certainly something I know Samir is here as well. So if you have any comments on it, feel free to weigh in. But yeah, we've tried to be as clear as we could within section 5.3, which is kind of our speaking to media and social media, that panelists are able to speak to the media. So yeah, it's. I don't know what to do about that one, in particular because, again, we're kind of saying we recognize that you are uncomfortable with this, but the hope is that this code of conduct applies to all panels and to all potential future chairs. So if a future chair of the panel really does want to kind of control messaging around the panel, we wanted to allow for that possibility. That's why it's in there, and why we kind of said if the chair doesn't want that, they're free to waive it. I don't know if that's.
I would have thought every panel's free to make adjustments to the code of conduct if absolutely necessary. If you had a chair that wanted that on a entirely different panel, then you might address it at that point. Anyway, are there other comments? Does anyone else have feedback? Because I feel like we're at a bit of an impasse, but before we sort of figure out what precisely we ought to try to do it, I'd welcome other panelists' views, especially if you're not on the governance committee and you haven't had a chance to.
I guess my take on 5.2 and 5.3 is, and tell me if I got it wrong, is I can say whatever I think on my own behalf whenever and wherever I choose, and that if I'm giving presentations or something about this, I need one of those disclaimers like I have at the beginning of every public talk I give that says my opinions are my own, they're not on behalf of whoever I'm working for at the time. Is that basically what this says?
Yes.
Well,
And if I can just add, being part of some of these discussions, I think you'd be hard pressed to find an agreement that's ever 100% perfect. But I think what I was encouraged in this was that Waterfront Toronto's legal team did do what they could to meet us halfway as much as possible. Obviously, if we could mull over this for a couple months or more weeks, that would be great, and we would definitely have a better product. But the timelines were also working against this, and I thought it was important to have this at a place where we could all be comfortable signing this.
I support many of the remarks that have already been made about the distinction between representing the panel, which I think absolutely we need to be clear when we're speaking as individuals, unless we are the chair or have been authorized, and making public comments about the panel, which is a very broad, thing, scope. And so I agree with Michael's reluctance here, and I guess I fail to see why it is necessary to have that second sentence about in 5.2. And I wonder whether we could remove it at this point, or at least indicate that this is a version of the code that applies to DSEP, and just leave that out. Is that a possibility, or do we have to accept or not this draft as it is currently written? I know we don't want to take a lot of time about this, but I think that there's a strong sense that at least that second provision, sentence in 5.2, is not warranted in this case.
So, hi everybody, Samir Akhtar, legal counsel here at Waterfront, Toronto. Just to be clear, the intent, 5.1 talks about speaking on behalf of the corporation. 5.2 talks about speaking about the panel. So, in order to have we thought for governance of the panel, it should be, you want to have consistent messaging about what people are saying about the panel. Now, in terms of your statements about, in a personal capacity, that's covered under 5.3. So I think the way it's structured in 5.2 makes a lot of sense, in that we've empowered the chair of this panel and the other panels to have a degree of responsibility about the communications and the way that the panel is governed.
I guess my follow-up question would then be, the two sentences are very different in that the first one is only the chair can speak on behalf of the panel, but the second one is panel members must not speak about the panel. And so
They're different.
they're very different. Like the word about and the words on behalf of are probably the crux of the matter here.
Right, and you're right. They are, that the chair is the one who's authorized to speak on behalf of the panel. They can authorize others, but we also want to have consistent the messaging of people's. We want the discussions to happen here at the panel. Comments about the panel, aren't. That's not a conducive way to have good governance of the panel. If the chair feels it's okay for people to make comments about the way the panel's working, or about other members of the panel, or the mandate of the panel, things like that, that's for the chair to decide.
So Samir, can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
That second line in 5.2, which seems to be the more contentious line, if you look at it in concert with 5.3 and the final section of 5.3, I think the same protections are actually granted there, given the circumstances that we're under. Like I think if 5.3 stands, then that second paragraph of 5.2 could be eliminated as a solution to that. If anybody wants to chime in.
I must admit, I think it can be eliminated with or without 5.3, because I don't really see the connection between the two. If your concern is, and I see the kind of the structure that you've got, someone specifically who speaks for Waterfront Toronto, someone who specifically speaks for the panel, and then the role that panelists can play in public statements in 5.3. But that second sentence doesn't achieve what you're hoping it achieves. The first sentence does. It says it's the chair, or in theory, I could say, Charles, can you please speak on behalf of the panel? I can't be there, or whatever. I could ask any panelist to speak on behalf of the panel. This doesn't say that. The second one isn't talking about speaking on behalf of the panel. It's saying must not make public comments about the panel. And with respect, if your concern is that Waterfront Toronto doesn't think panelists should be talking about the panel outside of this room, I mean, that strongly goes against later comments about not limiting academic freedom or fair comment and the like. I'm sorry, but no one here would agree to Waterfront Toronto circumscribing our ability to speak frankly about anything. particularly where we speak on our own behalf. So I must admit, I don't if your goal is to ensure that it is the chair that controls who speaks on behalf of the panel, the first sentence does that.
Right.
Full stop. And you don't need the second sentence.
But the other issue is people speaking about the panel.
People are free to speak about the panel as long as they make it clear that they are not speaking on behalf of the panel.
Well, I think the best way to accomplish that is for the chair to give that authorization to the panel to give them the ability to make those comments on a one-off basis or on a blanket basis.
Well, I don't understand why, like, I don't understand how the second sentence in 5.2 is at all consistent with the third paragraph in 5.3 where it says we should not make comments that disparage or hurt the reputation of Waterfront Toronto or the panel. I mean, I would have thought that was the big concern when talking about it, and I mean, those are two very different things. I mean, a blanket, don't talk about it. I mean, does that mean I have to make sure Google doesn't know I'm here? Because I'm pretty sure they know where I park. Like, you know, like my phone's here. It's.
What I think is like, what does speaking about the panel mean? Charles is wearing a black shirt today on Twitter. Is that speaking about the panel? Like, what is? That's a really broad statement.
It does seem an unnecessary complication given 5.3.
If I can make a modest suggestion, perhaps the easy solution to this is changing the third paragraph on 5.3 to be in 5.2. If it's saying very similar things.
No, it just heightens the contradiction.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it does, yeah.
Alright.
I think where there's a I think maybe the spirit of it is there are we okay with panelists being critical of the panel itself or Waterfront Toronto? I think what we're feeling from a panel perspective is we're actually okay with it. It's a public panel. We're not behind closed doors. We're not, our proceedings are public. Our documents are public. But there may be some nuance around criticism of Waterfront Toronto itself that might be different there, since we're a constituted body by Waterfront Toronto. So am I allowed to say anything about Waterfront Toronto publicly that's critical, that we consider critical? So I think there's room for discussion there. The blanket statement about not being able to say anything about the panel seems crazy broad.
Yeah. It's just
So
not
we'll
the spirit of what was
strike that.
intended.
I don't hear anyone speaking in favor. So I think the consensus of the panel is that they like it stricken. I mean, if your concern is that Andrew and I shouldn't debate on Twitter some panel matter, I mean, I think we should be free to do that.
So Samir, I'll propose that we.
Or even have a debate in public that gets televised, whatever. I mean,
So
that's fine.
I'll propose that we strike that, and then we can talk about whether it's struck only for DSAP or if DRP and things like that needed as well. But for at least for DSAP purposes, we'll propose striking that.
All right. Are there any other comments, or if that's out? I think I know that when we talked about this before this meeting, the hope was to provide panelists with an updated version after we've had this discussion, and then people certainly sign it in advance of the next meeting or as soon as practicable. Are people comfortable at this stage? I mean, it's up to you, of course, ultimately whether to sign or not. But are there any other big issues that are going to pop up afterward?
In other sections?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have problems with 5.3, media and social media, and 5.4, requests for disclosure. And in particular, in 5.3, the statement panel members should not make comments that disparage or hurt the reputation of Waterfront Toronto or the panel. And I'm concerned about the breadth of possible interpretation of disparage or hurt the reputation of those are, as far as I can see, rather broad and not well defined, and could include all kinds of things. Like I think that the panel should provide lunch, right? Is that disparaging or does that hurt the reputation? mean, there's a whole lot of things. If there is a concern about that, why not use language which I understand is much better defined, which is about defame, right? Use the language of, of defamation. I would be quite agreeable to that. The other is in requests for disclosure. A number of us have commented on the breadth of the first sentence in request for disclosure. Panel members who receive external requests to disclose confidential information or other information or about Waterfront Toronto must not disclose that information. So that is way too sweeping. Why not leave it at we shall not disclose confidential information, which seems to me meets the basic requirements, and I think we're signed up for that. But to not be able to disclose anything, I mean, or to have to, get the
We get it.
I think you've got
I've done
people.
What?
I think that, I'm seeing immediate comfort with limiting it to just to confidential information. On 5.3, I would note that the not making comments about disparaging is immediately modified by not intended to limit academic freedom or preclude fair comment on matters of public interest made in good faith. So if you were concerned about the lack of lunch, that perhaps is fair comment.
Well,
I would assume it's made in good faith. No, I'm just the
Yeah,
point.
sure.
The point is that it is not quite as broad. I don't think as you're suggesting. There is an attempt to make it clear that as long as it's in good faith, that it's fair comment.
Yeah. So how would that be judged? I mean, what are the standards of that? Do we have anything to go on? And that's why, I mean, I was suggested that by a lawyer that defame, and you know better than I, whether using the words defamatory does have you're frowning. So perhaps you're.
Well, I just don't think we need to get into a question of establishing legal tests for the purpose of this. I mean, it's a code of conduct for people who are volunteering for a public panel. It's trying to send a message about sort of what's out of bounds, and that boundary basically is trying to say don't disparage in bad faith against Waterfront Toronto with unfair comments. I guess speaking personally, it doesn't strike me as that unreasonable standard.
Okay, well that's.
Yeah, just to support Michael, I think if you use the defame language, you're suddenly into a legal question and an obligation that in fact is very, very narrow. And I think you could say things that were not fair that would not necessarily be defamatory.
But if it's said in good faith,
then fair comment made in good faith. So there needs to be both fair and in good faith.
okay.
So I don't think this is intended, and I don't think it does prevent you from critiquing Waterfront Toronto. So if you think there's something in, for example, in the consultation process that you don't believe Waterfront Toronto is conducting appropriately, I think you could critique that, and I think that would be viewed as entirely appropriate under this clause.
All right. I think it sounds like we're there. So if with that, if you could provide an updated version based on that reflect these comments back to panelists, so panelists will be willing to sign. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was good. No. Thank you, Carl. I think that's even in our mandate that we're public in these, and this is public, but it's helpful to be reminded of that importance. Thanks. I think see people are in agreement with that as a principle of how we govern ourselves as well. Okay. Okay, if we're good, then we can move on, please, to the criteria working group.
So the criteria working group has met a few times. We shared back out what most of the work we've been doing has been deciding how the panel should formally respond to the MIDIP and what would the process be, who would do the work, and how would that work go forward, and what structure would that documentation be. So we put together, and this was shared out to panelists a couple of weeks ago, basically a draft outline or process for with milestones that align with the public consultation and the work that's being done by Sidewalk and by Waterfront Toronto. So we have a fairly aggressive schedule for providing comments and feedback as we move forward, and it runs from July 3rd, which is passed, all the way through to December, I believe it's October 14th, to submit a final report. What we've come up with is that there'll be two stages. One is aligning kind of with the stages that are working with Waterfront Toronto. One is preliminary commentary on the MIDIP as it has been given to us. And then a second phase where we would actually issue a formal public report, which would be a consensus report of the panel, but would accommodate minority reports as well. And panelists would be free to also submit their own reports in association with it, so that all voices would be heard and all points of view would be represented. We've actually come up with a general process, so perhaps looking at the structure would be helpful if you've got the document in front of you. We've looked through, basically put together a process for how we would actually put the report together. So there's a couple of versions of this document floating around. One has only subtopic leads and one has report leads. So happy to discuss which we prefer. But I think what we originally conceived of was there would be 2 or 3, perhaps 4 report leads that would be basically running in committee that would work with Waterfront Toronto's as a secretariat, and Vance would provide support to that. And I've got 3 volunteers for that committee now. Karen, and I've got Mark and Andrew who's volunteered, and I'm happy to throw my hat in to help with that. Then we would have subtopic leads, so people would actually volunteer to do a deep dive on each of the subtopics that are in the evaluation structure that is in the document. So I'd like to throw, I'm going to assume you've read this, so I'm happy to throw it open for further discussion. What we'd like to look for is general approval of this going forward so that we can start working on the preliminary commentary right away. Perhaps we don't need every T crossed and I dotted in order to move forward, but happy to entertain discussion on this.
My only question I had is, would I be able to submit an audio file to one of the leads instead of trying to type it all out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the offer always remains if you wanted to send an audio file, Vance can transcribe it for you and send it back to you so you can verify that that's an accurate representation.
Cool. Thank you.
I will add, I actually prefer audio. I listen to most of the plan instead of reading it.
You can only hear so much of my voice before you fall asleep.
Comments at all?
If I could just add one small question. When you say subtopic leads, do you mean for the master plan or do you mean in the report? So that they would help kind of take what is in the MIDP and frame it for each topic section that is laid out in this table of contents.
My impression was it was the report,
Okay,
but others may have different.
okay. Just wanted to clarify.
I'm not sure we'll need the 2-tier structure. I think that may be kind of overkill if you got 3 or 4 people leading. I mean, how many topics do we have? 5?
More than
6?
that. Well, some of the topics have many subsections
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the subsections like IP, like none of us on
tiny bit of experience in that subject. So
Okay, sorry.
commercial, not legal.
I mean, certainly
I
we,
presume that we have all of the competences to
That's fair.
look, you know.
That's fair. I mean,
yeah,
you'd need to assemble some folks to make
Yeah.
sure you had the appropriate.
we might try to
competences.
recruit people.
Yeah, sure.
So just to add to that too, if there's something that the panel themselves don't feel like they have all of the expertise, that is actually a fair comment to say that, you know, within the limited range of our review, this is what we would recommend. However, we recommend that Waterfront Toronto secure additional expertise on these matters. And that would be something that if you're uncomfortable with the IP piece, for instance, that we would rely on our advisors, so Tim Banks and George, for example, to advise us on those pieces with your thoughts factored into those, but not assuming that you're going to have all of the answers to that.
Yeah.
I also just had one other quick clarification just with regards to the timing and the flow and what is actually on page 94 of the book. There is a statement there about the below are based on a revised minute being received by September 1st and will be adjusted to should any delay occur. So just to be abundantly clear, we have had no date discussion with Sidewalk Labs in terms of a firm turnaround time, but more importantly, we do not anticipate ever receiving another 1,500 page gift. The reality is that it would be more of an appendix type of submission if we do get anything further from them. And I just want to be clear that we would not be restarting from a new document. If there are changes, it would be a very succinct document that would reflect those changes across the MIDP. But timing and the exact nature of that submission are TBD.
the delay is the wrong word to have used. And I say that because I wrote it. So.
what I might suggest we do to move forward is we convene this minute review report committee of 4 who have put their names forward. We then put it out to the committee that if there are panel members who are particularly interested in any of the subtopics, we have experts here on privacy and other areas that we definitely would be reaching out to, or if there's interest, then they can put their hands up for some of the subtopics as well. Just start.
And to be clear, any panelist can comment on any topic.
Absolutely.
There's no limitation.
And I would recommend beginning to comment as soon as possible, like not waiting for this committee to be struck to begin comments, because it's going to run out of time real fast.
And we have documents already available with the structure for you to comment on. There have not been any comments yet, but to start commenting.
I didn't add any because I assumed I had the wrong version of it when there were none in it.
You are the second person I've heard that from.
The other thing I just wanted to offer too is that if it would be of help to this group to have a time where we schedule an opportunity for the panel subcommittees to meet with George and Chantal and Tim from a legal perspective to understand some of the legal constructs. We can schedule that once you get further down the path, just to make sure you have the insights that you might require if you would like additional external support.
So just for point of clarity, it's just so it is appropriate to focus on areas that you really want to focus on, that you feel that you have a greater value proposition, as opposed to trying to be spreading myself too thin.
I think it's your.
That was what I was trying to
I
figure
think
out.
it's your call as a panelist, but yes, I think if there's areas that you know very well that you're more comfortable with, start there.
Okay.
So I think the one thing is we're commenting on the digital aspects of this, though. I mean, there are lots of other aspects. We're not commenting on the appropriateness of tall timber or whatever.
Or the affordable housing strategy that they're recommending. It's, you know, and what I attempted to do
Although
actually.
you may have opinions on that.
Right, in the management report, you'll note that I actually pulled the note to reader and put the sections in that relate to the work of DSAP, so that way you are perhaps guided through and less tempted to go through. You're happy to read the whole thing, but in terms of what this group's scope is really in that space. Now, there might be other comments about other things that could be part of some sort of a dialogue near the end of it, or whatever the case may be. I know there's been some conversation about sort of the early consultation process and what that's looked like. So balancing how that fits in, but the bulk of the focus should be what's in those sections of the note to reader.
Yeah, I kind of see it as almost like 3 layers. There's like the core digital innovation chapter, the IP, the innovations that are being proposed, the executable applications that are being proposed. But then there's a digital element to many of other things in the report, so drawing that out. And there may be a third layer, which is sort of a general framing commentary around the way everything fits into the larger plan.
One of the things that I don't see in this list, and maybe that's because maybe it's deliberate, is there isn't really a section that deals with the financials around the digital innovations and strategies. And so one thing that caught my attention was that there's a couple of references to Sidewalk providing things at cost. And those words just ring alarm bells in my mind when you're dealing with software development. Because
What
like
is the cost?
software development costs
Yeah.
are enormous, and so if we're going to be paying to develop it and then not recouping the benefits, so I think perhaps we should set out a financial section or something around those concerns.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion.
I had similar questions around operations and some of these things.
And so
Service maintenance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think there are like a number of sort of financial considerations where I'm not saying that what they're proposing is necessarily good or bad, but based on my experience with digital, I think there are things that you need to take a long, hard look at and not take them in the way that you would like a construction, like a builder who comes in and says, I'm going to give you this at cost. That's a good deal. But when you're talking about software development, that's
Knowledge
not a
work
good
is
deal.
intangible. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
I have some questions about the relationship between our digital evaluation and the evaluation of the digital pillar, which I understand is can be done separately through a scorecard and so on. And we commented on an early version of that scorecard, or at least the evaluation for the pillar, as opposed to sort of a more comprehensive view that we're doing. And so I think it's important for us to be able to understand what is being done. In that other evaluation that I understand, is it being done by McCarthy and Denton's? Is it based on this KPMG?
So the
And we also had some concerns, I think, Mark and I anyway, I can speak for Mark, but I had some concerns about that scorecard. It's having some problems and shortcomings.
we can certainly have a conversation about that sort of more in detail. I think that was the intent of one of the meetings that we had earlier on. That will be completed by Waterfront Toronto staff, as well as Denton's and McCarthy's, in terms of its compliance with the very limited scope that was in the RFP. The intent is that this report will be much more broad and far-reaching than that. So I acknowledge that it is a very limited scorecard, but that's because of the nature of the RFP. And I do think that this group, getting further down the road, again, in the spirit of not releasing the exam to the students before they actually get to market, there would be a potential for a bit of a brief closed session just to go through the full scorecard so you understand how things are being scored across all of the pillars and how this interrelates. But that would, again, be something that would need to be done a little bit in a closed session.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I look forward to that.
Okay.
I have some questions about that.
And we'll have KPMG also come in and discuss sort of the methodology as part of that.
So I think the anxiety, Christina, would be that, and I appreciate the need for the scorecard related to the RFP, but presumably the recommendations ultimately that go to the board aren't just based on that scorecard.
No, that's correct.
So that's I think the critical
but
question, Andrew.
There's the broader series of must-haves, must-dos, and so on that are also layered into the full evaluation criteria. So we should probably revisit the richness of that at some point.
And I think that would really help in terms of setting the context
Okay.
for what's the significance of the scorecard.
So knowing, getting a better sense of the role that our report will play to the extent that it can be done.
In those final recommendations.
Yeah, that
Okay.
would be very helpful.
So just the last thing on this is I would just draw panelists' attention to the proposed timeline, and that we are, for the preliminary commentary piece, we're saying that August 16th would be where we would share that preliminary commentary with Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs. So that doesn't leave us with an enormous amount of time to get the commentary together and pull it together into something that's comprehensible by those reading it. So start commenting.
So is August 2nd the preferred date? Is that what I'm reading?
Yeah.
So just to hold us accountable, would you like to have at least some comments from our panel members by August 2nd?
Yes.
Okay.
The final report is the 16th.
Yeah, so that's
So-
what I'm
Yeah.
okay.
August 2nd is when I think people should target to have their
Okay.
comments.
Yes.
If in
please.
fact there are additional comments after the fact, that's not a terrible thing, but you should be targeting to have your comments in by August 2nd.
Is there gonna be a draft of the report circulated?
Yes.
So it's gonna have to be before the 16th.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Okay.
tight.
Well,
Yeah, this
Yes.
is ridiculous.
August 9th is the draft.
so just
Oh,
to
But this is a commentary,
Oh, I
this is
see.
not
Just a
It's a commentary.
Yeah.
It's
So-
not
this is not the
Yeah.
final evaluation.
Right.
Okay.
Nor is it a draft report, as I understand it, but rather an initial commentary.
Okay,
On a draft MIDP.
Yeah, on the draft.
all right.
It might be more along the lines of the kind of commentary that we provided on that draft chapter that we had before.
Okay.
So,
Anybody, just to make sure, anybody online that didn't have an opportunity? Okay, or somebody has.
ahead of time.
Good. Awesome.
You could use that time to give us your comments.
Yeah, the Ontario Government's got
August 9th.
Yeah.
That's why we call it the 2nd. So we
All right, so
collate it.
why don't we do the Ontario Digital Strategy now?
Yeah.
Then we'll just break when you're done and run along to the side.
sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi everyone. Are the people online, are you able to hear me clearly? Yes, great. So hi, my name's Alex Lougheed. I'm a senior advisor in the Ontario Cabinet Office. I work in a part of a division called the Ontario Division. Common bureaucratic thing to list where we're coming from. Just automatically jump into it. I work in a division called the Ontario Digital Service, and we're supporting the Minister of Government.
Just if you're online, can you please mute?
The ocean sounds great.
Comments
All
and
right.
letters at the beach.
Okay. And we're supporting the Minister of Government and Consumer Services in the creation of Ontario's data strategy. I'm also joined by my colleague and boss, Jacob, in the back there. Put him out as well. And happy to present this to the panel as well as to others. And before I pop this off, I had a chance to listen into the prior proceedings of the panel, and I just wanted to express gratitude for the openness in which this panel is doing its proceedings. It's helpful for us on the government side to keep track on how discussions are going. So I'm going to provide a high-level overview as to the activities of the provincial government as it conducts consultations towards the creation of Ontario's first data strategy. So the first reference was in the province's budget, 2019. The words are up there, but to vocalize it for those on the phone, that data is transforming the world around us, and the government needs to catch up. This is why the government is supporting the digital transformation through ongoing consultations in the province's first data strategy. The strategy will be developed based on citizen and business feedback, so the government can develop a data policy that will help citizens and businesses harness the value of data. As this panel will know, the concept of data is very broad in its policy reach in the modern digital economy, so we've decided to structure it in 3 parts for our discussions. The first pillar, as we're calling it, is promoting public trust and confidence. So that's in the face of growing risks. We want to introduce world-leading, best-in-class privacy protections to ensure public trust and confidence in the data economy, understanding that data frequently represents individuals and individuals have rights. So that's really what that pillar is focusing in on. The second pillar is creating economic benefits. So there's obviously a lot of economic value within data itself. The Economist, with the analogy, data is the new oil. Creating economic benefits is really about enabling Ontario firms to develop data-driven business models and unlock the commercial value of data. So that's taking the whole commercialization approach. And then the third pillar is around advancing better, smarter, and more efficient government. And that we want to unlock the value of government data by building the data skills and capabilities of the Ontario government's employees and promoting the use of data-driven technologies within the provincial government itself. Data policy typically is bifurcated in society. Privacy laws are split in two between the public and private sector. So this is really about ensuring that the provincial government is really maximizing the potential that it can of these new technologies, new and emergent technologies. Guiding us overall is 5 admittedly high-level principles. First is that the province takes data privacy and its protection and data protection very seriously, and that is paramount to us. That data policies must be beneficial, transparent, and easy to understand. That data is necessary for effective and responsible government decision-making. That data should be collected responsibly and kept safe and secure, particularly under cybersecurity angle. And then lastly, that data is a key economic and social driver. So that's high-level framing of our initial approach to these issues. And we're going through a public consultation active right now. So in the spring, we began with a high-level survey to just really begin a conversation around some of these issues. And in subsequent slides, I have some of the findings of those surveys, and they kind of reflect some of the consultations that you have been running and that Waterfront have been reporting back. Phase 2 is active right now through the summer. So we'll be holding roundtables across the province, as well as hosting an online engagement platform to explore the key topics in those discussion papers. Cities include, and apologies for the truncation, Toronto, Stratford, Sarnia, Sault Ste. Marie, Ottawa, as well as Peterborough and Thunder Bay. So we're doing a provincial, we're hosting roundtables in each of those regions. And then finally into the fall, an important thing about those summer consults, we'll be releasing discussion papers on each of those 3 pillars as well to kind of structure the feedback that we receive from the public. And then finally into the fall, we'll be refining those recommendations through focused discussions on solutions both in workshops and online. For this consultation approach, we're following the Ontario's Public Engagement Framework, which some people may be familiar of, as well. To support this process, the province has assembled a short-term advisory body to give advice to the Minister of Government Consumer Services, and it's stylized as the Digital and Data Task Force. So it's a short-term advisory body composed of leaders and experts in the field of data. Its role is to make recommendations concerning reforms to statute, regs, regulation, policies, and programs. Its findings and recommendations will be summarized into a final report. We have an enumeration of the various members of the task force there. And to those online, I believe it's in the agenda materials as well, and you can also find it on the website, ontario.ca/data strategy. And so we did initially run apologies for the slide. We did initially run a web form as a first round of consultations. My background is actually in math and statistics, so I'd be remiss to say that a voluntary opt-in survey does not replace public opinion research. However, this was really meant to be a kind of first thrust for the government to collect the public's opinions and as well to kind of identify what people's concerns are. And so we had a kind of mixed response. We allowed people to self-organize and self-classify who they were coming from. And so we had a mix from government, industry, and institutions / not-for-profits, representing about half of the respondents, and the other half of the respondents were the general public. And we asked a couple of questions here, which I'm kind of hearing echoed through some of the consultations the panel is undertaking. And there's a slight typo on the slide. One of the numbers is reversed. Bonus marks to the student if you can identify which. we asked the question whether or not the respondent believes that data about people and businesses in Ontario needs stronger protection. There was an overwhelming yes response to that at 80%. And we also asked whether or not the respondent feels that businesses generally do a good job of explaining what they plan to do with your data. And the overwhelming response there was actually a no. Just flip those labels. This is a typo that persists. It's hard to weed it out. So the overwhelming response was a no at 83% as well. And through kind of the free response surveys, we coded the responses and heard that the respondents feel that current data protections are inadequate. The businesses can do a better job of explaining data use. The individuals should have more controls over their data, and that governments / independent organizations could have a role to play in addressing those issues. So that's kind of a high-level overview of where we're at this moment. And so what's next? We're entering into phase 2 of our public consultations. And those key activities include the release of an online platform, of which the details I presume will be made clear shortly. I know the team is hunkering away very quickly on that. In-person roundtables with organizations as well as members of the public. So we'll be doing some public consults as well as some more curated roundtables. That's in those cities that I mentioned prior. And then lastly, a series of discussion papers to inform the consultations, understanding that this realm of data writ large is broad. Discussion papers can help focus in on kind of what the province's priorities are, and also just help structure the discussion and make it more richer among the public. The recently struck Minister's Task Force on Digital and Data will continue to meet and provide the government and the minister advice to inform the strategy. And lastly, aligned with best practice, we will be publishing the dates of upcoming consultation sessions on ontario.ca/data strategy. That's ontario.ca/data strategy. We also have a newsletter on there as well, which we will use to exclusively inform the subscribents on the matters related to the data strategy. So that's it from my presentation. I believe we're open to questions.
Would you like to inform the folks of when the Toronto roundtable is going to be?
Is that public yet, Jacob?
Yes, it's on your
It's
website.
on your site.
It's on the site. Okay, great. I wasn't completely sure about that. The engagement team has been working really hard. It's next week, correct? Give a thumbs up. On what date specifically? Do you remember?
July 31st.
Sorry, the 31st? Yeah. And it's being held at Ryerson, I believe. Being a little bit caught off here. And it's being held at Ryerson. And so that will take place in the evening, I believe starting at 6:30. As well. And so don't trust this fallible narrator. Do go to ontario.ca/data strategy to get the official details as well. Thanks for that. I guess I'm not sure protocol here. I normally go through chairs. Go for it.
What topics do you expect to publish discussion papers on, and rough timelines?
So each of the in-person consults will be structured around the 3 papers. The first paper that will be released is, we're structuring them based on these pillars.
So there's 3 papers coming?
3 papers.
Okay.
The first one is being structured around promoting public trust and confidence.
Thanks. I appreciate the focus on economic development and citizen use of data, but I'm interested in knowing how you're including the nonprofit sector as part of your strategy, whether it's some of the short papers will be, or whether some of the roundtables will include them specifically.
That's a great comment. It's still early days on the consults. One of the nice things about doing the early survey is that we got to identify who the interested kind of stakeholders are and proactively reaching out to us. There was a handful of not-for-profits that did reach out. And we were trying to target each of our engagements in regions where there was a lot of interest as well. I know that I recently had a meeting with to not-for-profit groups, just speaking to the need and the role of not-for-profit engagement in this space, with, for instance, the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, as well as potential other stakeholders. So it's definitely on our radar. In terms of our formal plans, I can get back to you with that sector.
Thank you for the presentation. Since Ontarians are also Canadians and in some cases North Bayers and Torontonians, is this effort, is there any alignment happening with what the work that the City of Toronto is doing on data and the federal government is doing? And if so, how is that being done?
So we are actively following the activities at the federal level with the release of the digital charter, as well as in regular communications with our municipal colleagues, particularly here in Toronto right now, but we also have an open line with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario for outside of this specific region. Those conversations I would say are still early and ongoing. It's obviously for individuals here on the ground, the federated nature of Canada's privacy laws, they don't really experience that in a day-to-day, they just see data collection writ large. But the federal nature of our current regime kind of does bifurcate responsibility on those things. So we're in regular correspondence to the best of our ability to coordinate the other levels of government. Thanks.
Andrew?
Yeah, obviously our interest is in what does this mean for the Sidewalk Labs proposal and our work as a panel. And you're probably acutely aware of the Auditor General's finding or report to claim that there wasn't an adequate policy framework for data governance or digital governance for this initiative. And I'd like to, I'm sure others would like to know, what's the relationship between the development of your strategy and what's going on here? I mean, both in terms of the topics, what your aim is it the intention that the province is going to develop a framework that would provide a policy framework that would be adequate, say from the Auditor General's point of view for this project? And also then what's the timing on this? When would you expect to have a robust enough policy or strategy that it would provide a useful or way for us to proceed in thinking about this? And do you think it will be adequate? I mean, is that your aim to do something to provide that, or?
So I can say that this is a government that takes the Auditor General's most recent report very seriously. This government established an internal committee of Treasury Board, this is all in the public record, to ensure that the government does due diligence in its response to the Auditor General. In her value for money audit of Waterfront Toronto, recommendation 10 does speak to, as you say, the need for the provincial government through legislation to respond to these emergent issues that discussions around smart cities raise. To that end, the province has taken an early action, when I do say early. On May 30th, the provincial government released, let me get the language exactly precise here, 5 framework principles to require smart cities and the companies that create them. 2, and then the government released kind of 5 high-level principles to guarantee that Ontarians' privacy and personal data are protected, managed responsibly, and kept secure. That put people first by ensuring that Ontarians are the primary beneficiaries and valued partners in the opportunities created by the project. To create responsible and good governance systems that are democratic, accountable, and transparent. To enact leading and best technical practices that ensure chosen technologies use open software and open standards, are secure, interoperable, locally procured, flexible, durable, and scalable. And lastly, to educate the public on the risks associated with the project and provide meaningful opportunities for local residents to participate and engage in the creation of the smart city. And these principles were released at a similar time as Waterfront Toronto has released their principles, and also at a similar time as the federal government released their digital charter. More specifically, on the question of timing, is that the province is really keen to focus on its consultations to hear from the public first before it goes into more and more details. So aligning timelines might be difficult at this point, as the province is still in the listening phase, I would say.
Anyone on the phone? Thank you. Thank you.
It's Alex.
Thank you to the panelists for your volunteer work here.
All right, so we are about 20 minutes ahead of schedule, which is not a bad thing. So we'll break for 10 minutes or so, come back, and we'll have a little extra time for the sidewalk discussion. Okay, so on our agenda for the remainder, virtually the remainder of the entire meeting, is a discussion with sidewalks, starting with a presentation on business models. Then we'll have an open discussion on whatever people want to talk about. As I said, we'll kind of go around. I know there's a lot of people from Sidewalk in the room. Maybe they could just introduce themselves, and then I'll hand it over to.
Okay, sure. I'm happy to go first. Jeff Stuyvesant, co-founder of Sidewalk Labs and head of development. Why don't we start there?
I'm Prem Ramaswamy. Many of you know me, head of product at Sidewalk Labs.
Elisa Harvey Dawson, head of legal data and privacy governance at Sidewalk Lab. Privacy governance. Yeah. That's
Here, Eugene Kim, Associate Director of Privacy and Data Governance at Sidewalk Labs.
Others in the back there?
I'm Jackie Liu, Sidewalk Labs.
Chelsea Colbert, Sidewalk Labs.
William Fields, Sidewalk Labs.
That's all.
Oh, and I think Chris, who's working with us.
Oh, and Chris White.
He's up there now.
He's back up here. Chris White from Urban Metrics is here. Should we want to delve into their work at all? Okay. Thank you. Are you all okay if I come a little bit closer to you? I feel like you're way back this direction.
Stand on the table.
And is there anybody viewing remotely or by video that I should be aware of? There are. Okay.
Yeah.
So just want to. That's helpful for me to know. So thank you all. I've had the opportunity to be here once or twice before, but pleasure to be able to join you today. We'll go through a brief overview of where we are in the process and the MIDP, and with a focus on the business proposal. My understanding is that is where, in your process of review, that is sort of the biggest subject area that you want to make sure to focus on as we progress through the consultation and evaluation process. So let me just set the stage for context, and then along with Prem and Elisa and the rest of my colleagues, we will try to answer as many questions as possible, and I will go quickly through this. You all are familiar with the draft MIDP, Toronto Tomorrow, that we have formally submitted to Waterfront Toronto and made available to the public. It is a large document. I know we hear a lot of comments about all 1,500 pages. Those of you who have participated in the past in large-scale planning efforts, often they are in fact quite voluminous, and so we sort of figured we need to do all the work on all the subjects and be comprehensive and thorough about it. We tried to organize that in a way that is digestible. The first volume, volume 0, is the overview, which is really a summary of all the pieces. And so if one were to focus to just start to understand the fullness of the proposal, that's the starting point. I will note, Prem and his team have been working very hard on ensuring fully accessible versions. The overview that is available online, 1, 2, and 3 will be very shortly on a rolling basis. Volume 1 focuses on the plans, the manifestation in the physical and the digital planning for the achievement of the outcomes that Waterfront Toronto asked for. Remember, everything about the proposal flows from the original questions that Waterfront Toronto asked, which I continue to view as highly courageous for a public entity to sort of say, we'd like to try to do business differently than the standard, and we'd like to prioritize and pursue climate positivity, economic development, affordability, all these enormously important public policy objectives. The plans in Volume 1 are a response to that. We start by addressing a core question that Waterfront Toronto has. So we have this asset at Quayside that we want to leverage towards these objectives. They also said what is necessary from a scale perspective, from a planning perspective, from thinking about the project to make those outcomes viable, and also to achieve the greatest possible outcomes. The plan in Volume 1 goes very deep on Quayside. It is where all of the innovation is integrated into a holistic plan for that property. For you all, and I tell this to many groups, there's a section in Volume 1 that I find, at least in my experience, has been very helpful, which is the how it works, which is really sort of says from a people perspective, what does it all mean? How does that plan actually, how all the innovations in that plan manifest themselves? How do they work? How do they function? What do they do? We then said there is scale in our work. There is scale that's needed to really sort of carry forth the innovation and enhance the ability to achieve the outcomes. And so we identified essentially a second project we call Villiers West for a portion of the western side of Villiers Island, where we would continue the approach at Quayside, working with the public sector to carry forth the innovations that are tested, proved out in Quayside, and further advanced at Villiers West. We also view Villiers West as the opportunity for a major driver for economic development. You have to get it, it's okay. And that is where we envision what we refer to as an urban innovation hub, where the collection of things that happen there become a primary driver for the development of an entire new emerging field, urban innovation, for the economic activity, in my view, all the way across the waterfront. This builds on the enormous energy coming from the work at, whether that's what Daniels has achieved at Artscape, with Artscape, at their new building just opened, it's amazing. What Menkes is doing with the Waterfront Innovation Center in partnership with Waterfront. There are a whole bunch of projects that are already carrying that momentum east. We actually think that this at Urban Innovation Hub at Villiers Island could in fact, even in partnership with the outcomes happening at East Harbor, be a major driver of economic activity. Very important clarification. What we have said is that we think additional scale would be advantageous to maximize the impacts and the outcomes achieved. That, however, is scale for government to achieve those outcomes. It is not for Sidewalk Labs to continue what it does at Quayside and Villiers West. At Quayside and Villiers West, we'll talk a little bit more about this. We see ourselves as being directly participating in the development. That is not the case for the rest of what we have identified as the idea district. The notion there is if the innovations prove out, if in fact there is a model to be based on, the public sector could adopt through guidelines, through whatever mechanisms, and think about the rest of the development of that area as part of a district to be planned at and thought about holistically. And that's what we mean by the idea district. It is not a sidewalk project for the rest of that. Volume 2 goes very deep on the innovations across a number of categories. I should note that the digital innovations actually really sort of cut across the other 4 as well. We can spend the rest of the day going very deep on all of them. I think what's important here is that there are ideas that have been developed in places but are carried further here than used before. There are ideas here that do not exist elsewhere. The innovation cuts across whether it's digital, physical, financial, a whole bunch of different components of what it takes to create a place and to maximize the policy outcomes. All of which are subject to the data and privacy standards that you all know very, very well. We have proposed to hold ourselves to the highest standard possible. I know, as you just saw, there's a lot of great work happening, frankly, at all 3 levels of government. We're eager to engage on that and eager to work with government for whatever policies emerge for this project and all endeavors. Let me speak a little bit then about the partnership. Volume 3 is all about the partnership, the business deal, the proposal itself. First and foremost, this is a public sector-led project. The idea district, like I said, is all about public sector control. And what we're proposing to do requires a strong public sector partner. That's why we've proposed there be a public administrator. I should say, we took the path that it's not our place to say what entity that is. We are obviously here because of Waterfront Toronto and are huge believers in what they do and in their capabilities. as an organization. That is a decision that the public sector needs to make. That public administrator needs to be able to work with a regulatory framework that allows for things to be done differently. In some places that's a very minor piece, in some cases more significant, but the whole intent of the endeavor is to make sure that that regulatory framework allows for innovation, allows for things to happen differently. And third, we've proposed a set of financing tools. Frankly, they are tools that are tried and true in many locations, but the public administrator should be connected to the financing strategy also. All of these things should be thought about holistically in our view. We have two core objectives. The first is we are a for-profit company, we're a commercial enterprise, but we are extremely mission-driven. And so that means two things here. One, we need to generate sufficient returns for our business model. And secondly, we want to be part of something that actually does try to achieve the policy objectives that Waterfront Toronto has put forth. That is important to us. That's why we exist, to be able to have that impact. And we think that it's achievable and feasible while also generating a sufficient return. I should emphasize, once again, you've heard this many times, the business model in no way, shape, or form includes selling data or personal information as part of the way that we would make money. The proposal that we have in Volume 3 is the result of a lot of time, 18 months of work of talking to all three governments, to Waterfront Toronto, to the public, all kinds of stakeholders. And I do want to emphasize these principles are extremely important because first and foremost, as I said, everything flows from the ability to achieve the objectives that Waterfront Toronto put forth. Secondly, we've really tried to figure out how do we maximize what we can bring and structure our role around that and only around that. Third, scale is a word that gets tossed around with this project in a lot of different ways. The scale is to achieve the outcomes and to maximize the outcomes. It's not necessarily scale about our participation. I mentioned the strong public sector oversight. Where possible, we try to build on proven approaches. The reality is there's a ton of great work that, whether it's Waterfront, the City of Toronto, the province, whoever, it's done, private sector actors, and so we've tried to shape everything to leverage that to build on top of that. I mentioned phasing the notion of sort of Quayside into Villiers West, and then the potential for the public sector to expand beyond that. And lastly, we've tried to align financial interests between us and the public sector. Our roles, there have a few different pieces to it. The first is the development of real estate and the advanced infrastructure systems. That's where Quayside and Villiers West, we've proposed to lead the development. What I mean by lead the development is that it's critical that the program of what gets built reflects the plan for innovation. So we need to have a degree of control over that, but we are committed to doing that development with local development partners. On the innovation, planning, design, and implementation, we've proposed an advisory role to Waterfront Toronto, where we work with them to help understand how to integrate systems, whether that's beyond Quayside and Villiers West, or even how to think about the many things that have to happen that are within the public sector purview, even for Quayside and Villiers West. Technology deployment, a primary focus for this group. We have really two roles. One is to advise Waterfront Toronto, or whoever the public administrator is, on the procurement of assorted technology services, and in very specific instances where we believe there is something that is foundational to achieving the objectives but does not exist in the marketplace, Sidewalk Labs would provide that technology to the project. Lastly, we've proposed contributing to the financing of infrastructure. This is not a core part of the business for us. It is just a way to potentially help, if useful, to essentially what I would call front end whether that's transit infrastructure like the LRT or other municipal infrastructure that's needed for much of that part of the waterfront to be developed. Each of those roles have economics that's associated with it. The commitment on our side for the first role in developing the real estate and advanced systems, our model right now says it's about $900 million in equity that we would put into that project. That's almost a $4 billion project. On the advisory services, we would want to enter into a multi-year advisory agreement with Waterfront so we can together think holistically.
we have a series of investments we would make that are either standalone in their economics, like the standing up of a tall timber factory, or essentially grants like funding for a new institute I'll talk about a little bit, or something like the venture fund we propose that would have its own economics. On the technology deployment, we'll talk a bit about this. That we've proposed a profit sharing system for that, whereby we think we accurately reflect that in fact there's value created by the public sector in the development of targeted technology projects. The optional financing for infrastructure, we've modeled that at about $400 million. That could go a lot of directions. That's entirely up to the government as to what path they would choose to finance infrastructure. In terms of business model, the real estate is very traditional in how it thinks about revenue sources. I will say that because of the innovation being and the investment required for that, Quayside, the economics are more challenging. Part of one of the many reasons for the inclusion of Villiers West and the thinking about them together is that it helps bring the economics in total to a more reasonable and sort of market level return expectation. On the advisory services, we provide that at cost. That is really designed to be a participant in the holistic thinking. It is not a major revenue source for us. I talked about the standalone economics. Where there is a technology we deploy will be provided at cost to whatever entity is in fact the user. And on the optional infrastructure financing, that would be at market rates per sort of working through with whatever public sector financing strategies. We have also proposed one other source of economics for us on the project, something we refer to as performance payments. That reflects two things. One is there are certain forms of upfront investment in the innovation which there's no other opportunity to recoup any of that investment. And so the theory from us is that they prove out, in fact, lots of things happen, and we will have to make sure that those are sort of clear milestones and are achieved, then there's an opportunity to recoup those costs. And secondly, we believe that this project as a catalyst has the potential to greatly accelerate the pace of development in the proposed project area. And so therefore that is value creation that there would be some form of compensation for. We have not proposed a definitive amount or timing or structure for that. That is something to be worked through with Waterfront Toronto, but we believe those are the two premises upon which the notion of performance payments would be a part of that. As I said before, much of what we have tried to propose is essentially to leverage our strengths to be a catalyst. So if you think about real estate development, you take the idea district, the geography we proposed, the two projects, Quayside and Villiers West, are only about 16% of the development there. The whole point is to do just enough to sort of catalyze other things to happen. In that role as catalyst, we think in the technology realm, we can help be a catalyst for an ecosystem, and that involves funding for a new institute that could be the portal for learning that could happen in the project to be transferred to academic institutions or other entities. Is obviously an embarrassment of riches in Toronto and Ontario. On the university side, all of whom we have been talking to about the idea of creating something new that would be additive to the ecosystem. The funding we've said is initial to sort of take that first step to sort of think through how do you stand up a new institution and how does it function. I should mention it's not envisioned as a Sidewalk Labs entity. It is purely something we want to be a catalyst to help get going, and then should be an independent entity. And then lastly, the profit sharing I mentioned, which really we have not found another model anywhere in the world of the notion of recognizing value created by the public sector and its participation then in the profits generated. On the procurement, again, we would assist the public administrator in the procurement of services and technologies needed. And where there is that need for a key solution that does not otherwise exist, that is where Sidewalk Labs in a very targeted way would provide it. Our general mandate is to utilize external sources as much as possible. If it exists, we should use it and not try to recreate something. Here we set the example of the super pond. Beanfield is in place here, and so we would be very eager to work with them on the achievement of the super pond network. I talked about the purposeful solutions. I do want to mention a very important piece of that equation. We have something called Testbed enabled technology, which means that testbed conditions exist. This is very important because the profit sharing is linked to the tangible demonstration that there is value created. What we mean by this is that it's not easy to develop new technology products. And in order to do that, you need a set of conditions to exist. And so, by definition, just saying, yeah, sure, come and do it, is not enough. The regulatory approvals have to be in place, the commitment to adapt if there needs to be changes needs to be in place. So we've just tried to be very precise in saying the public sector can absolutely create value here, but here's the conditions that have to exist in order for that value to be able to be realized. We arrived at the 10% profit share over a 10-year period by looking, literally we scoured for examples and models. We can talk more about how we got to that, but we think that it's fair. We think it reflects the value contribution in the testbed conditions if they exist. And we also understand that we would have to establish a system whereby upfront anything that qualifies for this is identified through a rigorous process with the public administrator. We've also included in the proposal a patent pledge that essentially any patents we file in Canada, others would be able to utilize with no interference from us. Elisa and Prem can speak much more eloquently about this than I can, and the impact it can have on helping to foster an ecosystem around us. And lastly, there are obviously a series of commitments we've asked for from the public sector in order to be able to move forward. Partnering with us, sort of, like that's a given. Sourcing a targeted limited number of products is a key piece. The establishment of the Idea District is really about forming a way to think holistically about the project and the area around it, and to think holistically about the public sector actions that can help enable the innovation to take place. I mentioned the performance payments, the disposition of land for the Quayside and Villiers West projects. And then there are certain things we believe as critical, such as the achievement of the Waterfront LRT as part of the mobility network. We think as catalysts, we can be a powerful enabler of a lot of economic activity. These studies are always complicated undertakings, and people have a range of views about them. That's why Chris is here if we want to talk about any of that. But I think what's important as a takeaway is that we think an endeavor like this can accelerate development that would not otherwise happen, and more importantly, undertake it in a way that allows for the policy outcomes and spurs economic activity that may not otherwise happen. I should also note that when we talk about innovation, it's not just the digital and technology pieces. Our embrace of timber as a building material takes one down a path where there's as much innovation in the production and installation and fabrication and the creation of buildings from that as many of the rest of our work. And so whether it's the economic impacts or any aspect of the approach includes innovation across a very broad spectrum, which means that in job creation, a range of jobs we believe will be created across a spectrum of industries. Some, frankly, we have no idea what will exist down the road. But there's an opportunity to create a diverse economic ecosystem, and we think that that this plan can do that. It can be a catalyst combined with all of the sort of policy oversight from government. So let me just close with, there's obviously a whole bunch of outcomes we think that this will create. First and foremost, the whole point is to radically improve quality of urban life. I think you know all of these, but it's all critical components of the full picture, and that's what we've tried to put forth in the draft MIDP. So let me stop there. I think I came in under my 20 minutes. And let us shift to Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think we're right on. So we've got about an hour and a half, I think, for discussion. And as I mentioned, the way I propose that we do this is to really give everybody an opportunity. We'll start with 5 minutes for each person, to ensure each person has up to 5 minutes if they want to use it, but you're not, of course, required to. That should still leave some additional time for further rounds, and people are free to talk about questions that may have been sparked by this presentation or by
Can I ask a really dumb question? Does the 5 minutes include time for us to answer, or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, no, the way I want to do it, yeah, it includes the response. I meant, sorry, at the very top, I'm kind of modeling this a little bit on the way government committees often structured. And so if you can get your question in before the 5, there's time enough extra to.
I just don't want to offend by taking anybody's time up.
No, you'll have the time to. We'll make sure you have the time to respond. So I'll do my best to track and make sure everybody gets an opportunity, which is really the goal. You can either just let me know, or you can do it through Slido just to throw it up. You don't have to put your questions there. Just let me know that you'd like to ask something. So, who'd like to get us started?
Thank you for your presentation. I've read not all 1,500 pages yet, but I have read significant portions of them. One general comment I have is there's obviously a lot being proposed. There's a lot of things in there. As a plan, and this comment will lead to kind of more specific question. As a plan, I would probably want to see a little more on, I know you've got the how and how it works, which I appreciated to have in there, but a little more detail on the how it works, both the financing, the operational side, and the governance side. So I'll give you an example. For example, when you mentioned about Sidewalk being a technology procurement advisor, it would be good to know, and I think the public may have some questions around that when you mention, well, when there are gaps, well, who decides what the gaps are? Because you're kind of putting yourself in a position where you may develop the technology with the 10% return and the returns that you may get, but then you're also saying, however, it could be a third party, or in some cases the residents may choose, for example, the Superbond network, they may decide to choose their own technology. So like, how is that going to work going forward? And not just in year 1, but in year 5, because I think it's like we sort of want to know who will decide what and what's the model for that going forward. Another example is the koala mount. So if let's say there's a standard that gets developed there, if there's a generic or another company that develops it, is it okay? And who would decide whether there could be a second kind of mount that's brought in? Is it Sidewalk? Is it the public administrator? And how will that work? That's really.
You'll let me know when it's okay for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So let me take a first shot and then hand to Prem and Elisa. So we've tried to think through how do you structure a situation where the public administrator has the ability to determine, is it unique in the marketplace or does not exist in the marketplace, or are there other options? And so, I think that is an area where we've tried to lay out a reasonable amount of detail on how to do that, but we will have to work with, in this case, Waterfront Toronto, to really flesh out how exactly that process works. But the intent is, in fact, that there would be a predetermined and clear and rigorous process to determine that, not by Sidewalk Labs, but by the public administrator. I think on some of you went a little bit deeper on detail. I want to sort of Prem and Elisa chime in.
Yeah, so as Josh was saying, and I don't know if you got to that part, it's in, if I'm sitting here, can people hear me on the phone?
Yes.
Okay. In volume 3, where we talk about procurement principles, we talk about the fact that there would be this public administrator who would be responsible for setting up the rules of engagement, and as Josh has said, we think that's subject to, a lot of further and useful discussion. What I think is key is that at the end of the day, if you think about sort of the procurements that are going to happen for this district, and you juxtapose that with sort of what happens in a regular procurement, we're not trying to sort of recreate kind of the rigor that it would take to figure out what the requirements are and things like that. We're going to advise on how we think things should work in accordance with Waterfront Toronto's objectives, but it would be up to the administrator to ultimately make all of those determinations in our plan.
Yeah, I'm good. I have another question.
Go for it.
As we've seen with the development with technology coming into our cities, the traditional way in which we've designed our cities is changing, and we're having to bring together different methodologies. So agile methodologies that are based in technology, design thinking,
and then the traditional kind of design charrettes. I'm wondering whether you can speak to a little bit more about how that is there going forward, if the plan is adopted, how you're going to bring all those different perspectives together, because to me that's one of the main innovations that we'd be looking for here. And secondly, how can we make sure that the public is very much a part of that design process? I noticed that you have the Civic Assembly and Care Collective Network. I would like to hear a little bit more about how those would be resourced and how would they actually be plugging into the actual design of the neighborhoods.
Prem, you want to start?
Yeah, I can answer the first part a little bit better. So we spent a DSAP talking about our product process internally, the double diamond slides, if you remember those, I think one or two DSAPs before. The goal of that was to present the idea that we are bringing two very different worlds, one which often takes a very waterfall approach to technology, with the idea that once a procurement is created, that that is your item you're procuring for not only now, but then you're going to maintain it for the next X years in the future also. So it's a contract that gets written for a very long time period on top of that. Some of the fundamental things we're trying to do from a technology perspective is the idea of modularity with smaller modules that communicate via standardized, let's call them RESTful APIs or something similar to that, where the communication method between the modular elements are swappable essentially. And then also distributed in nature. We've seen this before, by the way. That's what the internet essentially is, which creates a complex system that's still very resilient and reliable for many individuals. Now, what we wish to do along this path is to bring, obviously, folks along with us as we design this. So as we design Koala as a small example of this, there are use cases we define that we think Koala is useful for. We go out in the community, we talk to users about that. Now, the community in this case is the business community who may be interested in utilizing it for specific use cases, the government community that may be responsible for regulating it, as well as the overall community that has to see it on the sides of buildings and walls and what they want to see and how that works out. To give a concrete example of how that's worked in the past, when we ran the Digital Transparency in the Public Realm project, we ran a large design exercise with our rapid prototyping team that worked closely with multiple rounds of community engagement, not only in Toronto, but also in different cities around the world, because we think of some of these things as kind of global standards that we want to push forward. In other cases, such as, when we work closely to launch Common Space, we work closely with two organizations here in Toronto to work closely to do a needs assessment with them to understand what they would want from this process, how they would see it. These are common kind of design thinking processes that we are excited to actually bring back into the urban realm. Josh heads up our real estate development team. Myself, along with Craig, lead up our software development team. And it is sort of that urbanist technologist divide. And there are concepts from our world that are seeping into Josh's world, as well as we're learning from Josh's world certain areas where there's good reason for the process to be a little slower. And so we're learning from one another as we go about this path. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether going forward, as you're projecting with the plan when you release the final plan, whether that can be shared a little more about how you might be working going forward with the public administrator, but also internally to help the public understand how these things are going to get developed. Because sometimes just saying that, there's going to be this district and this is going to happen, it might give more comfort to say, how is the citizen or resident being involved? What methodologies are you using, and what is Sidewalk doing versus what the public administrator is doing in terms of procurement and design methodology?
Yeah, and I challenge us to go a step above that, because we've done this already, I believe, with a few of our products to date, and then even going back and using those as a case study and projecting forward and how that would work in different scenarios, I think is what you're asking for, which I think we should do.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, and I think even our working through our internal working process and team integration, I think is actually, we're on the forefront of how do you do this differently, and I think we'd be delighted to talk more about that.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to focus on the economic development side of this for a minute. So I appreciate the modeling that's been done and been through some of these exercises before, and it shows what might be possible given a set of assumptions.
Yes.
And depending on the range of assumptions you make, you you get a whole lot of different results. But it does demonstrate what might be possible. And you've talked a fair bit around acting as a catalyst, and some of the things that you're doing, allow the Urban Innovation Institute, Venture Fund, etc. What I would be interested in is sort of moving from catalyst to commitment. And there's some strong statements of intent within the MIDP about prioritizing, Toronto, Ontario, Canadian firms. But I think there's an opportunity to go farther in terms of commitment, and I think of the kind of thing that happens in major defense procurements where there are industrial benefit commitments that are made by organizations to in fact catalyze industries. And I also note that if I look at what is in the digital section in terms of services, there are some major procurements that are in fact innovations that include digital but may not have digital at their core. And I think of the thermal grid, the electric grid, maybe even the robot delivery systems. There may be other areas like that where you're talking about doing major procurements as opposed to developments. So if I take what Sidewalk's going to do, procure directly, and also some of these other RFPs which would involve other large players, I'd be interested in some kind of a specific commitment that, just to pick a number out of the air, would be like a 50% commitment that would be Canadian procurement. And the reason I say 50% is that it would allow for technologies that are from elsewhere that are innovative and will contribute to the quality of life objectives to come to Toronto, and that would be great. But it also perhaps encourage some of those firms to locate within your urban innovation district ultimately. So I'm interested whether that's a kind of idea that you might be interested in pursuing.
Do you want to keep going, or should
No,
I?
that's the question.
Listen, we're deeply committed to this being a catalyst for job creation, and are very big believers in it. And to date, just in the work we've done to date, we've worked with I think the number is 95 Toronto, Ontario, or Canadian entities just to get to the stage where we have the proposal fleshed out, and we have I think it's about 130 entities, and that's from the spectrum from for-profit all the way through to not-for-profit that we have engaged already with. It's some level of consideration of potential partnership over time. So it's something we're deeply committed to. I think it's a really interesting idea. My hope was that from coming at a similar output from a slightly different perspective, we've tried to achieve that the notion of a community benefits agreement is moot because everything that achieves is so baked into the project and the proposal. And I have a similar perspective on this. We would be very open to considering what kinds of commitments are viable. The only thing I would amend that with is we need the ability and flexibility where it does not exist to in fact sort of achieve that procurement from whatever it does exist. But I think we're very open to these kinds of things.
Have more time?
You do.
I do. Okay. Just from that level to the technology level, I'm struggling with the benefits of the network digital infrastructure you're proposing, as I look at it, there's nothing that couldn't be achieved with today's technology. I don't need a software-defined network. I don't even need SuperPON. I can just extend what I have in the fiber world, and essentially you're proposing ubiquitous Wi-Fi, which is fine. And the one area where there is rapid coming innovation, I don't see you taking advantage of, which is 5G. There's pilots being run today with 5G. Whether it's going to be Huawei or not is another discussion. But so I'd be interested in some commentary on what the real value is in the networking, because I'm struggling to find it, and why you aren't looking in the one area where there is new innovation, 5G, to actually harness that in some way.
So I'll ask Brent.
So I'm gonna separate the answer into two pieces. One is the innovation from what we're suggesting to date. So you'll notice that I believe in Volume 3 we've stated pretty clearly we're not interested in being the internet service provider for the region. What we do believe is there are some technologies that internet service provider, if they take up, can have certain positives. So let's start with SuperPON as an example. SuperPON greatly reduces the amount of fiber, the ability of that laid fiber to be used for many more users, and essentially carry a lot more data over time, which essentially future proofs means you don't need to dig back up and put in more wire later, right? So there is I do believe there are some positives to planning that in advance in a future proofing sense of the word. Our sense of what the needed bandwidth is today is often not true of what's needed tomorrow. What we found is we are very data hungry over time with more and more services offered in higher and higher streaming video resolution. On the SDN point, this was actually a very interesting discussion we had here. I think it was 3 DSAPs before about the software-defined networks, and there was a question about centralization, which is what software-defined networks to some extent do, is create kind of the central network administrator concept versus the distributed nature of the internet itself, where everyone kind of has their own router. Now, there are pros and cons to each one. We will discuss with the ISPs why we think there are pros in a dense area to not have people in apartment rooms next to one another, each maintaining their own routers that interfere with one another from a bandwidth perspective, as well as avoid all of the security holes that happen when I don't patch my router properly with every update. So I do think there are very big community benefits to something like a software-defined network that help people with ease, the amount of hardware you buy, which creates the footprint of devices that essentially get recycled or thrown out over time, right? So I do think there are benefits to those existing technologies. To your point around 5G.
If I could just because 5G is another discussion. So, I mean, I hear you on the potential benefits there, but I don't see anything in the rest of the proposal that is dependent on using those technologies. So, if we don't go SuperPON, if we stick with the fiber, if we don't go software-defined networks, if in fact we stick with the Bell or Rogers guy showing up in your apartment to install a router every time, I don't think. I mean,
nothing falls apart.
Nothing falls
apart
there's,
on the fiber side.
There's some benefits that aren't realized. I appreciate that, but I don't think anything falls apart.
On the SDN side, there's one other benefit I will add, which I think is going to be unique, which is if you are placing IoT sensors on sewer pipes to understand if there's water leakage and things like this, for example. We know what happens in existing places where you do this, which is eventually they turn into kind of a hijacked DDoS network, right? And so how you prevent that from happening is you place them on separate software-defined networks where you can yank that off the network as required or quarantine it from a security and a cybersecurity perspective, right? So I think that is something that is unique here that software-defined networks give you control over in a way that prevents rogue actors, which I think does have value in this unique neighborhood.
Let me let you get to the 5G.
So on the 5G point, to be clear, none of this says 5G can't happen. We have not taken a stance on 5G. I believe what we wrote in the minute is 5G is naturally happening anywhere. To your point, there's very little I think we need to do to catalyze 5G. Every major telco is working towards 5G right now. The one thing we are stating is we do think Koala, the mount, the USB urban mount, because as you know, 5Gs require a lot more density of the router. That means they have a lot more places they have to put them, which creates a lot more capital cost to a 5G deployment. We think that if you have more of these urban USB ports located in more areas around an urban area, it actually may speed up the adoption of 5G. I will say that I personally, and this is my view, I think that even if you have 5G adoption, the idea that every single device is suddenly going to go 5G, it's going to take a while for my laptop to have a 5G receiver as well as transmitter in there. 802.11 has been a standard that's supposedly dead for many, many, many moons that has continued to live on. And I think Wi-Fi will continue to live on. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't taken a strong stance on 5G right now. Is that helpful?
Helpful, thank you.
Thanks. Teresa?
Okay, I'm going to get into the weeds of the Urban Data Trust and Data Governance Framework. And I want to just preface my comments by saying I have tremendous respect for the amount of work that goes into coming up with an idea like this, because this is a complicated concept and and an innovative one in many respects. And so it's very easy to pick apart. But I just wanted, so that's why I want to preface those remarks by saying I do respect the thought and the effort that's gone into it. So in terms of the theory of urban data, this is described in the MIDIP as data that no one can own, that this is, there's some kind of communal or collective interest in the urban data. And that jars a little bit with our traditional framework of public sector, private sector data and the different regimes that apply to public and private sector data. And at one point in the MIDIP, there's a discussion of, for the example is given of the city that wants to collect traffic data and that has to apply to the Urban Data Trust for approval and has to go through the RDUA. In order to get that approval. And for me that's jarring, because here's a body with 5 appointed people that's going to decide whether a democratically elected city government gets to collect data in the city. And that somehow has that decision-making authority over the public sector body in a context in which traffic data would traditionally be considered to be public sector data in any event, which would be governed by the public sector. So I have a couple of questions about that. One is, first of all, whether in your concept the UDT could actually say no to a request from the city to collect data, or could dictate the terms on which the city could collect data within the IDEA district. And the second one is whether in what you've looked at, whether it's even legal for a municipal government governed by MFIPA to delegate its authority over what is actually public sector data to an urban data trust. In other words, if the government does get approval to collect this data and turns it over, whether that's even legal under our public sector data frameworks, because the government as collector of data is the steward of that data. So those are my first 2 questions with respect to the data trust. I have others. I don't know if there's going to be time for those.
She's looking towards me, not.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, it's great, Elisa.
So, I want to take a step back from your question just to explain why during our process we wanted to make it clear that we thought it was important for even public entities to have to go through the Urban Data Trust. And part of that was the fact that this is a new district. We're trying to create a framework that is going to be equal and the same for all data collection that can happen. And because there is going to be that mix of public and private data collection that's occurring, how do we ensure that the same standards, the same responsible data use guidelines are applying for all data collection? We definitely appreciate the fact that public sector entities right now go through a process. They don't have to do the same consent framework under applicable laws, and they already do things like privacy impact assessments in order to justify. And so we think that our process is complementary to the things that government's already doing. What we think is additive, though, is that it enhances the transparency for everyone in the district in the event that something is actually done on behalf of a municipality. So that's the key. It was, how do we make sure that all data collection is going to be transparent for all citizens, regardless of who the collector is, to move them into this framework. Ultimately, this has to be decided and approved by the 3 levels of government. So you ask, is it going to be permissible for a government agency to actually go on through this? I think that's definitely one of the questions that people have to grapple with is, how can we set this up in a way through the process that we propose, which is the agreement with Waterfront Toronto that needs approval, that's going to enable this to happen. We would submit that it is something that could happen, and we've done, reviews obviously with our attorneys to say, how can this mechanism work so that you can have this type of structure for this district, and that is why we ultimately did it. I found it interesting, and I haven't read through all of it, but your recent paper on smart metering, where it was also that sort of public-private collection, it's something that could be beneficial to the community, but how do you, make rational both the private regime and the data collection that happens usually in PIPEDA versus, the public utility that happens through, I think it was in FIPA, and how they set up this, unique entity as a framework to manage that because it was a unique data collection that you wanted to encourage because it was beneficial, but you had to sort of rationalize two different regimes and how it would apply. And I do think that's a potential, model or example for how we could think about this data that's happening for this particular neighborhood.
Twice a little tiny bit of time. Okay, well, I'll throw out really quickly another question, and it comes from one of the examples they give in the report. So the Urban Data Trust seems to be designed to cover all collection of data within the geographic area, and an example is given of an environmental advocacy group, for example, that wants to collect data. To me, that raises civil liberties issues. Because this is not a private sector actor. This is an environmental advocacy group that's collecting air quality data but has to ask for permission to engage in that data collection. And so in terms of the boundaries of this type of thing, PIPEDA has exceptions for, first of all, it doesn't apply to non-commercial data collection. It also has exceptions for journalism, for personal purposes. There are accepted areas, and those are designed to respect the freedom of expression. And so I'm wondering how those boundaries get built into the Urban Data Trust, because I'd have a lot of problems if citizen scientists, advocates, ordinary individuals had to get approval to collect data, especially when it's defined so broadly from public spaces within the district.
I mean, the reason that it's set up, it's every party has to sort of live through the same standards. And we also were trying to come up with a mechanism to recognize that even the collection of non-personal data or aggregate data could have negative impacts and consequences on people if you didn't have people understanding what the general rules of the road are. So once again, that premise was why everyone's in. What we think will happen and what we talked about in the proposal is that the Urban Data Trust is going to have to develop rules of the road, natural exceptions, and probably including, for governments with respect to security. So if a government entity wants to put up something for the protection of the, security of the public interest, that's probably, that's something that's going to be clear that it has to go through a different process. I would think that something that could be proposed through the representatives of the Urban Data Trust are what other uses would fall into that same type of category where the same process doesn't have to apply, but here's the beauty of it is it's transparent. Everyone will know and understand. If there's something that meets that standard that you're talking about, then they will have a different road to go through, but it will be clear. There will be no ambiguity by the people, by government, by any individual as to how things fit and where they fell in this district. And that's what we thought is much better than what the status quo is.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for Sidewalk Labs, to all of you coming here and your massive work that you put into this. I have quite a number of questions. I hope I can get two in now and that we can follow up in writing. Because I'm coming at this point from someone like the rest of us who's trying to evaluate the proposal. And, while massive, it's not, in my view, actually comprehensive in terms of some of the key details that we will need to make a full assessment. So, for instance, say in some sharp contrast to the careful, detailed work that's gone into the Urban Data Trust proposal, I'm surprised that the MIDP is relatively thin in its details about the information that Sidewalk Labs would provide to the UDT for assessment of its purposeful solutions and its core services and so on, because after 2 years you must have figured a lot of that out, and perhaps it's distributed throughout the document, but at least from a point of view of an evaluator, it would be very helpful to have a comprehensive inventory of the kinds of information that would be collected by the various devices and how they would be used, what sort of processes. So basically, I'm asking for a comprehensive data flow and systems architecture overview, which is no small thing, but I presume it's at hand, and that would help get over some of the difficulty I have when you have illustrative examples, but we don't know everything. So that would be very helpful, and in particular, such an inventory would include, for instance, information about where all the sensors are going to be. The koala mounts. What do you imagine in Quayside where they're going to be, and what kinds of sensors would they be? What would they be collecting in terms of the data that is produced, and for what purposes, and whose benefits, and so on. So that is a large question, and you could answer it with a single word, saying yes, we will provide such a comprehensive inventory for the purposes of the evaluation of this committee. But you might want to answer more fully.
So first, I would say that there is a bit of technical work that we are doing that I think will be supplemental for a best amount of what you are describing, which is actively underway, and we are aiming to have for all of you in the time frame you need to have it for your evaluation process, but it's still a work in progress. I don't know if Prem, you'd like to add to that.
I want to add just 2 points to that. One is the idea that we know exactly what the final system looks like today, which we don't. Part of any design process is you start with a problem set and a goal you're trying to achieve, and you go through a design process of zigs and zags to getting to the final solution of what we want to build with the goals in mind that we want to reach from an outcome perspective. So let's use as a key example a mobility management system. We walked through what a dynamic curb system that's able to manage the curb side, what types of sensors those might require. As well as in the plan, we talk about the amount of curb space, so that kind of gives you some idea there as to what that looks like. That's about the level of fidelity we are at right now from a, we don't have these installed externally yet, is another way of saying it. They're not in the ground functioning at this point. On the koala mounts, we have provided a set of example things that third parties might create on top of this. Mm-hmm. We have a mount that has a light that works on it and has a LiDAR sensor that works on it. Right, yeah, we were impressed by that, yeah. So we are at kind of early, we're at early stages, to be completely honest with you, on a lot of these. We will be providing a level of detail that kind of provides you with examples of a data map, of a data flow for one or two of these, as well as, we have been publishing to date the RDUAs that we've done on different projects and experiments that we've pushed out, which we're happy to share kind of with this group and as we move forward, so you get an idea of the process that we're going through ourselves and seeing how this works. Does that help answer that?
It gets there to some degree, and I appreciate that. And one of the things, and you talk a bit about it, as you want to emphasize, what's the experience for people in that area? Well, one of the big questions, no surprise, has come up many times. What does it mean for me to be under, the watchful eyes or whatever, the sensing that's going on in this neighborhood? You've got these lovely images throughout all of the publicity, and everybody picks up on your artist renderings. But I can't find a single instance where the digital element actually becomes visible. I haven't found any sensors in there. Maybe I haven't looked at it everywhere. But that aspect has got to be visible. For us, both as evaluators here, to be able to get a strong sense of what is the sort of the data capture and use and processing environment that you're proposing here. We've got to get a strong grip on that, which I don't find in sufficient detail, notwithstanding the 1,500 pages. And I also think that a lot of other people, that's what they're interested in. And I'm struck that it's been so long before you've actually made any specific details on that. So I would like to see something that will enable us to make that assessment in a sort of a reasonably comprehensive fashion.
So to be a little more concrete on this, what specifically would kind of, do you believe would make you feel good that you have the level of information you have? Are you looking for example, if I would give you a block and show where things might be placed with their purpose and what that might look like?
Well, that would certainly help. I mean, your quayside area is not like only 2 or 3 blocks long, right? So why not, you've got renderings of that. Where would you imagine all of the sensors being placed and what capacities, LiDARs, video surveillance, motion sensors that you will need for your mobility solution or your core application and the others. You must have that, at least in some way, maybe not aggregated, but you're proposing these core services and these purposeful solutions, you call them, and what would that look like concretely?
So I think we can provide a draft of that. I would want to urge you to remember again that can change based on how technology changes,
understand
So
that.
as a small example of that, if we say there is a device placed here that can, in a non-personal way, identify whether it's a person, a vehicle, or a bike, right?
Well, that sort of thing. But if you've got a camera there, even if you de-identify at source, you're still capturing, live video images that would constitute personal information. So I would like to know how those are categorized.
But that's the level of detail where I think, we're realistically years away from actually implementing this. So to say it is a Numina sensor versus a MyoVision sensor would be, I think, incorrect on our part, right? In the sense that it's, saying whether it's a camera or it's not versus it's something that detects this ideally in this fashion is the right way, I think, to go about it.
But I think the materials we're working on you'll find helpful, and maybe there's a way to link back to your starting off question. Part of it is also maybe we can provide insight into the working and design process as this project would move forward, because a lot of these are unknowns now, and sort of how and when they become known, maybe that would be useful as well.
Okay. All right, thanks. Well, we may have another round. You've gone long, but we may have an opportunity to do some points.
So, for all of you who don't know me, and since I don't have a name tag, I'm Diane Reynolds. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Sidewalk Labs proposed launch services. So, as I understand it, this is generally speaking 10 applications or services. And I wanted to ask about them in the context of some of the, let's say, high-level commitments to open data, open source technology, connectivity, patent pledges, those commitments to openness and to not having one, let's say, organization, whether that's public or private, controlling data. When I look at the 10 specific cases, though, I see that 4 of the 10 actually have very restricted data in them, and 4 out of 10 is almost half, and that an additional 2 each have either what's termed high-level demographic data only or aggregate data, both of which can be very controversial, especially the demographic data, as to how easy it is to re-identify people from the aggregate and from demographics. And so I was wondering if you could address this apparent difference in the high-level principles versus the details of the proposal on this basis.
Sorry, can you just state again what you see as the difference there? Because you're saying that because some of them are collecting potentially some amount of identified and or aggregate information, that that data can't be made available?
I'm saying that there's a lot of upfront information in the overview about open data and making everything accessible so that you're not locked in, so that others can innovate on it. And yet somewhere between 40 and 80% of the actual 10 launch services are highly dependent on either restricted or potentially controversial and sensitive data.
So if we can bump up one level, which is that, so those 10 represent a much smaller portion of what will be required to make a city run, right? Like, just if you think about the full stack of everything that's required in even here in this block or 2 block radius, those 10 represent, I think, a smaller proportion of what makes a city function today, right? So those 10 launch services that we are proposing at this point, I think, are a much smaller proportion. Now, inside that smaller proportion, what you're stating is 4 of them include some amount of potential data that you couldn't make just publicly available to everybody, right? And I
They
think
actually explicitly say restricted data.
yeah, and I think, but to be clear, that restricted data, this is where kind of I think the Urban Data Trust comes into play, and I'll pass it on to Elisa when I say something wrong here. But I think the Urban Data Trust has the opportunity via business or contractual or regulatory ability to ensure that the use cases, access to it is still there. It may be more gated, that access, right, is the other way to think about that. Just because it's being treated as a public asset, as data collected in a city today is also supposedly a public asset, does that mean that each and every one of us have access to every piece of data that the government collects, right? But that access is gated by a regulatory body to some extent, and that's what we imagine the Urban Data Trust providing. Did I say anything wrong there?
She has a question.
Okay.
I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree about the perception that open data isn't necessarily as prevalent in applications as it might appear from the overview.
But again, I think there is a default towards the default behavior whenever possible is to make that open. And even if the data cannot be made open for different reasons, or it's gated to access based on use case and who's allowed to use it via either, as we said, business, contractual, or regulatory reasoning, that does not mean that the infrastructure used and or the piece of the puzzle to the broader solution still is not forced to use, standardized components in a way that it can be swapped out. I think these are different conversations about vendor lock-in versus the data.
And I would say that the principle, open or publicly accessible by default, one of the reasons we want to bake that into the responsible data use guidelines, and I'm proposing that provides a framework for the Urban Data Trust, is because that's a question that then gets asked every time, where today it's not normally sort of raised.
I totally get why that's in the trust. I just didn't necessarily see it, the spirit of it reflected in the actual proposal from Sidewalk Labs on what they were going to build initially. On that note though, a lot of these 10 applications do rely on artificial intelligence or analytic assessment of large amounts of data. And I was wondering, parts of the MIDP talk about data residency, but do we envision those engines actually being located in Toronto as well, or in Canada with the data?
I mean, so as Prem says, we haven't developed all of the specifics for what the architecture will be, where things will be stored. What I would say is that we're committed to using our best efforts to store locally, wherever it makes sense, unless there's security or resiliency or redundancy reasons why. And if we had to outside of it for those reasons, we would be transparent about it. But we're committed to using our best efforts to keep data that should be here.
And that includes applications, not just the data storage.
I would say
Yes, ideally we have dual redundant data centers for providers in Canada in a way that we can do that. I want to point out the redundancy issue is a problem right now in Canada. The dual redundancy issue is a problem in Canada.
So redundancy is a separate issue, but the primary engines and
yes,
because I know a lot of AI is right now very centralized in the US. No matter where you're using it from and where the data resides, it goes to an engine in a US data center.
I don't think that's true for both Microsoft Azure as well as I think Google Compute Engine. Both have neural network training, like, you know, cores in the data centers here.
We can debate that issue. And then
I think we're
out of time?
out of time. Thanks. Let me want a chance to come back.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go.
Sorry, can I just answer one more thing on that, which is, and the final, I just wanted to say, like, we're a few years out, right? Whether those fully exist today at the volume that they should exist right now, I strongly believe they will exist moving forward, right? Like that compute infrastructure is just increasing and getting closer to people because it speeds it up, right? It's a general business need where all the cloud providers are doing this because it serves their customers better.
One question. It was a great presentation, thank you. And in the presentation actually sparked a thought and a question that I had. And it's your final statement on the last page, on page 28, where it says a demonstration project for a higher standard and strong data governance regime in a smart city. First of its kind for Sidewalk Labs to do a project like this. For your organization, first of its kind for Canada to do something, which means that it is a demonstration project, but with that's going to come a huge amount of metadata from the learnings that you're going to gain around not just the RFP process, but the whole, consultation process, the design, everything else. When I looked back at your intellectual property page on 28, I'm just trying to be clear for people on the phone, page 20, you talked about intellectual property and the profit sharing regime, 10 year, so 10%, 10 years. In terms of things that were designed and delivered and deployed by Sidewalk Labs into Toronto, I just made me think a little bit about all of the metadata and intellectual property that you will, as an organization, Sidewalk Labs, have gained in doing this development demonstration project. Is there an opportunity for Waterfront Toronto to actually have a share of that? Because I would imagine that you would be able to have a playbook, runbook, that you go to other countries and be able to do something very similar with all of the lessons learned and all of the data that you've acquired and the experience from this demonstration project. Is there a reverse contract for a 10% profit sharing back to Waterfront Toronto for 10 years every time you deploy that, or some other kind of model that kind of reverses the intellectual property that SWL has gained on this project?
I'm happy to start with that, and then maybe ways that you can add. But I would say from a sort of philosophical perspective, we think that the benefits to public sector manifest themselves in all kinds of things that happen, whether that's revenue, whether that's economic development activity, whether that's achieving climate positive, whether that's finding a path together for a way to achieve a greater amount of affordability than has been the status quo. And so honestly, that's where we view the bulk, and not to mention there are some parts of the transaction where there's a payment for an asset. But our business model, this project is a focal point because it's where we have an opportunity to integrate sort of every layer of thinking about place and to partner with government to achieve that. But we are doing work elsewhere, and we will be doing that. And so I think in reality, as much learning will travel into this project as out of it. And my hope is that we thought with the technology aspect, that's where there's something new and unique that the public sector should participate in the value creation of, and that's really where it manifests itself. I don't know, Elise, if you would add about sort of different categories of IP.
I mean, I think I agree with everything Josh said, and I think one of the things that we were doing as we worked through what would be a good proposal was trying to figure out something that's tangible, measurable, that we could sort of all figure out and be accountable for, tie it to a specific project versus something that's ephemeral and you can't really figure out where it came from. And so, certainly anyone who works in IP, like having something that's concrete and that people don't get into arguments on, quite frankly, later on, was also something that we were trying to do with our proposal. And so tying it to those solutions where we could see how, you know, Waterfront Toronto and the government tangibly enabled us to move forward with it seemed like the best way to deal with to create long-term stability and a profit sharing model. But I definitely appreciate what you said, and you know, we have a long way to go with this project, and so
I just think
that's an
it's more of a
interesting
consideration,
concept.
if you have it as a consideration.
Yeah.
And I would equally propose that to Waterfront Toronto for consideration too, in terms of let's define what intellectual property actually comes out as such. I love the fact that you called it a demonstration project, because I think there's an IP label that goes with that and an outcome.
I will say one thing about your question, probably, I don't wanna open a can of worms with this crowd, but we rarely use the smart city label, and it's interesting that it was in there. I don't think it implies what we're actually trying to achieve.
Sure. So my questions will mostly kind of a great segue from your question is around the profit sharing. I really appreciate you putting public sector at the center of value creation in this project. My question, the first one is how did you arrive to those measures? Was it informed by any literature? And the second part of it is from a decision making perspective to be able to assess whether that is an adequate part of the proposal. Will you be providing any documentation about internally how, as an organization that will be undergoing this massive initiative, will be managing your growing pains, and what resources you'll be devoting for business development and in order to achieve scale?
I'll take a couple of first comments and then turn to Graham. I love your use of growing pains, by the way.
Yes.
This is, I mean, what we're trying to do, there's a lot of growing pains in many ways. We really scoured looking for models to use and arrived at the conclusion that there were none. If you all found any that you think somehow have helpful relevance, by all means, feed it to us. I should note one technical piece that the 10-year period we propose starts at the deployment to a second customer, so that it's not part. It sort of once it's a thing, it's a viable thing. We try to factor in all of the cost and risk that's borne in the development of a technology product, and therefore, how do you put a fair value on this other piece, which is creating essentially the canvas for it to be developed and prototyped and deployed. So you know, that's how we in the absence of sort of hardcore comparable examples, that's, you know, just from a very high level, we arrived at the percentage. We tried to look at you know, if you sort of are the lifespan of a product and what's a sort of fair duration. That's how we got to the 10 years. There are arguments about that's how a venture capital investment would look at a time horizon, but you know, we could debate. There are many ways to look at this. That's where we landed. You know, we're open to dialogue on this. We think it's very fair. We're actually quite proud of it and eager to sort of get into the details of how do you actualize a partnership like this. Graham, anything you want?
The only thing I'll add there is we added 10 years from the second sale. And the reason we added 10 years from the second sale was because, you know, we don't want it on the flip side to have any negative incentives for us to just wait until year 9 before, you know, selling it. You know, this pushes us to create businesses earlier internally that are successful, and that the clock only starts at the second time that we prove kind of market viability. So if you think about products, you know, your first customer is your proof point, but your second customer is when you're starting to figure out product market fit. So at that point, your second customer is when that clock starts ticking.
So the second part of the question, what kind of information from a decision-making perspective will you be providing to ensure that, you know, that scale for those products could be achieved?
So, you know, it's a great question, and one of the things that we've tried to do with the Waterfront Toronto team is try to provide some transparency into what are the resources we think are required to further develop some of the ideas. What do we think the time frame looks like? What are, in fact, a set of conditions for testbed conditions? We are huge believers in transparency, hence 1,500 pages. We felt like we had a lot to say. sometimes we veer a little bit into where we start to get a little bit anxious about commercially confidential information. And if working with Waterfront, there's a way to sort of further educate you all, we're happy to consider how we can do that effectively.
Do you have time for one more question? And the last piece is around the scope and the outcomes. Throughout the whole 1,500 pages, I heard a lot of pieces around why you thought it was essential to go past the wayside site, but when you look at outcomes, you only put what the idea district will achieve. And I think from a decision-making perspective, it's really essential that you kind of let your numbers speak for yourself. And I think from my perspective, I'd be curious to know why you didn't provide the outcomes you could achieve numerically, quantifiably, just doing Quayside versus the idea district.
I believe we did. That's definitely in there somewhere. We will come back to you to
Okay.
point out the exact locations because we have all that quite rigorously analyzed.
But I think like one of the example numbers that is in my head, and Josh, stop me if I'm wrong, is like with Quayside alone, we can only reach 80% in terms of climate positivity. You can reach climate positivity when that thermal grid and all of that's working on a scale the size of the idea district. That's one example.
It's also for a metric like that. It's also sort of 80% of a small area. It starts to get to. But we have those numbers, and they're definitely in there. We will make sure people know exactly where.
I will let. I haven't made a
Yeah, no, it's fair, and that should.
It
that
was
should
on
be,
page 833.
That should be. That should be easy to find.
Okay, thanks.
To follow up on Charlie's opening answer about agile and design thinking, we talked about the initial how we're going to ideate and create, but the second half is what I think we haven't answered yet is how do we quickly validate it to know whether to keep the idea going or kill it? Because if we keep scaling all these ideas, we'll never make movement on any one particular idea. So what is the validation criteria and who decides the pivot points?
That's an awesome question. So I think you have to break it down into sort of different categories. So, again, going back to the point I made before that the innovation, if you will, sort of lies across a whole bunch of different kinds of things. Some of it's digital, some of it's in building material, whatever it is. There's a risk and the ability to sort of understand it's achievable, that's necessary. And some of this we have to work out quite rigorously with Waterfront Toronto. But what we've tried to do is create a design and development process that allows things to incrementally be either de-risked or tested out, and therefore, if it works, great, and if it doesn't, we move on and find alternative solutions. So, for example, in the work that we're doing on timber as a building material, there's a whole bunch of other stuff sort of packed into that. We're already working on essentially as if we were building a 30-story structure with that, and working with government, working with a whole array of different actors for all of the different kinds of testing out, whether that's sort of fire resistance, whatever the issue is, so that there's a process that takes, a development project takes some time, and to use that time so we know incrementally we have to understand this by this point in time it's viable or not, and we can adjust and adapt and continue that on. In the digital and the product realm, I would ask Prem to sort of comment on how that process also works, but it's ingrained into every aspect of how we need to implement this. It also has to be reflected in between us and Waterfront Toronto and / public administrator, the distribution of the risk, right? We should need to take the risk that if something's not viable, we're going to provide an alternative solution to keep chipping away at those outcomes. Prem, whatever you'd like to add.
Only thing I would add to that is, from a product engineering design perspective, we're not working on everything right now. Because to your point, if we were trying to move everything an inch forward, we would move nothing forward enough to actually de-risk it. So we have kind of picked 3 places that we are trying to de-risk first. One thing I will also state is I do think incentives are properly aligned here for us, because if we do not de-risk the wrong things fast enough, then we end up spending, we are taking on all of the cost and capital burden of that risk solely as sidewalk labs. And so if we fail to correctly identify bad product ideas or bad explorations early enough, we are actually on the hook for those costs. And so we're aligned to kind of go through that process ourselves. We work, and this is part of the reason also the testbed conditions are set up around the profit sharing concept, because we can test it out at, a facility, but that's very different than testing it out on as an example of a mobility system on a curb. And so setting up those testbed facilities allow us to de-risk at scale in a place like Quayside, but that doesn't mean that we're just waiting until day 300 to turn the system on. We're very much testing throughout in smaller increments.
I would just add, I mentioned that there's also the role of an advisor that we propose, and one of the underlying rationales for that is that there needs to be a sort of constant feedback and iteration loop about further potential adoption of any of the innovations, and because we can't treat this as static in any way, and so that was some of the thinking behind that, is to sort of that process can't just be on us alone. It's got to be iterative with public parties.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any panelists on the phone that wanted to jump in before I get my five? No, any panelists on the phone? I know Chantal wants an opportunity once we've had a chance as a panel. And Pamela, did you want? Great, go for it.
You're good.
Sure.
This is Pamela Robinson.
And just to give a little bit more context on that, the notion was more about the reciprocity of the patent pledge. So the fact that you wouldn't assert is one thing, but to require other Canadian companies to not assert on something that they may be developing would actually be a disincentive for them to come to this area to actually be their deployment site.
Yeah. So, hi Pamela, it's Elisa, Harvey Dawson. So, it was not our intent and in fact, we don't require reciprocity. So we are not asking anyone to give a patent pledge and also agree to not assert. I think what people might be referring to is the fact that our patent pledge could go away if somebody were to assert a patent against us. So we're not saying that somebody cannot assert a patent against us. They absolutely can. This is not atypical. This type of situation is not atypical. If you look at open source licenses, if you look at other models of pledges that companies have put forward, sort of the concept of, if we're sued, then those rights could go away, but it doesn't mean you can't sue us. But we do definitely understand and appreciate that perception, but that was not the intent to make anyone feel as if they had to do the same non-assertion against us. Yeah, so for Open North, we absolutely looked at that, and we think that of the 5 characteristics that the Smart City Guide for Open North came up with, as their sort of guideline. We think that our proposal has a lot of consistencies with that, whether it's about having a beneficial purpose, in putting people first, having guidelines and transparency, easy to understand language, which we hope is a little bit represented by our digital transparency in the public realm project, and I can go on. So, we would like to think, based on our review of that document when it came out, that was, our proposal was absolutely informed by it and made better. So that was something that we focused on. What was the ISO standard that you mentioned? Do you know about the open data? No.
Yes, we do.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, we do.
Jackie Liu, who is our open data expert, who came to us from New York City, although she's Torontonian. Says we do know about that.
Yeah, we are aware of the ISO standard, but because with a level of kind of because of the level of our planning right now, we have not kind of done like a detailed mapping against those indicators, but we're absolutely aware of that as an indicator standard for kind of aggregate data and data publication.
And could you hear that, Pamela? Okay. Got it.
Thank you for, in 18 months, the first question about outcome-based code. That we appreciate. But it makes me happy. First I would say, I was last summer, I was in Jerusalem and I walked down the street and I was like, radical mixed use. And first of all, this is not a new concept in the world, and this is how cities have been wonderful and thrived in many ways for centuries, if not longer. I think the role of technology is to me at least, about time and about the ability to, over time, shift away from even having to think about use as a classification that somehow determines how people live, work, play, where they do things, and how the built environment reflects that. And so, I would defer to the rest of my colleagues on the need for what pieces of technology, but I would say I think this is a long-term aspiration. I think there are places who are, lots of governments, lots of professionals, lots of organizations thinking about a path to a similar kind of approach. But we sort of view this as there's a long-term aspiration, and sort of incrementally, piece by piece, we can start to make movement towards that. On the technology piece, I would defer to the team as to sort of, is it that intensive, or sort of how do we think we take some of those steps?
And Pamela, to your point, I think you're completely correct that if technology is not needed, we shouldn't use it. So I would leave it at that. I think there are areas, though, from an outcomes perspective, where things don't necessarily live up to the outcomes that they are built to. We see that in terms of, something gets LEED certified or Passive House certified as a building structure, but from an actual functioning perspective, is it actually, from an outcomes perspective, reaching that level of whether it's heating, cooling, climate positivity, whatever the term is? I think many times that's missing, where the goal is to get the stamp of approval and not necessarily prove that's how it functions in the real world. Another example of this, for example, that we've discussed internally is, the accessibility inside buildings and spaces where, there's certain hard-coded rules around that stuff, but does that actually mean an individual can get from A to B? And if you were to model it, does that actually exist or not? And you can model these sorts of things in software before you go build them, where they're much harder to change over time. So I think there are some limited rules, and we'll learn along the way and see where it is actually beneficial and useful over time. That's really cool.
Okay, a real quick one, Pamela.
Yeah.
Definitely would love to check that out.
I would also just want one comment, which is at the end of the day, my hope is that this endeavor allows policy innovation that can really have impact, and maybe is in fact a better path to some of these objectives. Absolutely.
Were there any other panelists on the call right now? I'm not sure if there's anyone. Okay. Hearing none, but you can come back if you happen to be there and have a question. But I guess I'll use my.
Your turn.
Going last has disadvantages because there's some really great questions before. I want a couple things on the super pond. I guess I'm still trying to understand it in light of a lot of the talk around ensuring affordable accessibility to digital infrastructure. So who gets to use this network? Who would be in a position to use this network? Is it just the residents and businesses that are located on Quayside or perhaps IDEA, or does this 50 kilometers that this can extend mean that I get to use it anywhere in the city and it's accessible to other people?
Look, at the end of the day, Superpond, I think we're getting stuck on what was a published paper as a standard that anyone can pick up and use. What we're talking about, I think when we talk about a term like a catalyst, is working with local telcos, whether that be Beanfield, Rogers, TELUS, whoever it might be, and showing them how this worked, why it works better, why it results in less equipment, lower amount of repeaters that are required, and higher bandwidth through the same amount of pipe, right? Like that's just kind of a goal here, right? Which kind of checks off a bunch of boxes in terms of future proofing with less equipment, and many people can implement and use it. And it's just us working as a good partner in the space and hoping to implement something like this. And we hope to implement it in Quayside specifically, and we hope it spreads further, right?
Okay, because I guess I was left confused with this idea, even that someone living there would be able to use this. I mean, part of the features that you talk about from security perspectives, I can use it here, I can use it when I go to the park or to my office. But if my office isn't in Quayside,
right.
Or if I go to visit my parents in North York, can I still see my dog? Or
Yes.
is that now lost?
Well, so you're right. You're right in the sense that a lot of these features will work in the local area, but again, it depends on the partner we work with on the software-defined network, right? Or the multiple partners that we work with on that software-defined network to become more of a standard in a broader space, right? By the way, there are things you can do to, from network perspective, to just escape the topology you're in with information. Obviously, you got to be careful when you do that. But there are ways that you can still see your dog in your example.
Yeah, oh no, I can probably go online now and see right now. But that's using the networks that exist today. So it still leaves me a little bit confused as to what the real innovation is.
To me, the big part of software-defined networks, as I mentioned, that we like about it is, the two key benefits we see is one, the amount of hardware I need as an individual and the technical knowledge I need as an individual to set up my own network, and when something goes wrong, the amount of mess that creates, as well as the interference from the neighbors and all of that stuff, just becomes a lot less stuff, a lot less wires, a lot less overhead as an individual who resides in this neighborhood. The second part is around the security of kind of the rogue network, the rogue devices on the network, the ability to quarantine rogue behavior. That is actually, I think, the bigger positive that comes about this from a cybersecurity perspective for Quayside, which is unique to Quayside, because we imagine Quayside probably having an explosion of devices.
All right, thanks. I would just note, just to close on Superpond, that it's not that I check every one of your footnotes, but the footnote that you use on Superpond to say that Toronto would not be the first to have this, that San Antonio already has it, that article does not reference San Antonio, nor does it reference Superpond. I don't know what you were trying to cite, but
We might have had the wrong footnote then. We'll check it.
Okay, just so you know.
Yeah.
It talks about Google Fiber. It doesn't talk about any of it.
Okay, we'll check out the footnote.
Right now.
Correct.
So,
This is in the MIDIP?
Yeah.
The footnote in the MIDIP? Okay, there were footnotes also in the slides we presented on that. Was that correct?
This is mid footnote 10 in the.
Okay.
I'm a law firm.
Wow.
Okay. But I actually.
I'm impressed.
But no, I actually looked because I was trying to understand what on earth this Superpond is, and was hoping that maybe I would learn from the footnote, and in the end I didn't learn anything.
Didn't we share the white paper though with you folks also?
No, I just within the context of.
Oh, got it. Okay.
All right. Data residency or local tech. I'll do local tech. So we saw from Ontario, even the Ontario presentation we had earlier there is a lot of emphasis right now on prioritizing local technology. And you make that pledge too. And I must admit, there's obviously some political wins behind that. At the same time, it sounds distinctly un-Googly to say that your choice of technology will not be the best technology necessarily or the most innovative technology. It will be the local technology. And I'm trying to understand how you would anticipate reconciling, on the one hand, a desire, or it seems to be almost an obligation to say you're going to prioritize local, but at the same time, I'm sure we do lots of really great local technology, but there's going to be a lot of times that it's not local. That's what you ought to be using if you really want to be the most innovative.
I think part of the simple answer is also it's a district we're building. We're not, the web is not local, but a district is, right? Like there is some locality to what we're creating. I think we, I was giving a talk yesterday to a bunch of developers, and one of the things I was mentioning was that a lot of the innovations with Koala, these are tied to a physical location, to a regulatory concept that we hope will be taken up by this group here and pushed forward around the Urban Data Trust, that I think reduce regulatory uncertainty and cost to starting up. And that combination should create an explosion of local firms in the space that sort of come here because this is the place where you MVP your thing. This is the place where you start up, and I do think that can exist. I think that will exist in the long run. I also think that Josh, when he was giving the answer earlier about this, he did say that there is this caveat that it should, what we use should work and it should be good technology that works, right? That there's that caveat to doing it locally, but I think there's a lot of good technology locally. We've talked to over 100 different startups locally, talked to, some companies represented by people who sit at this table who I think produce really good technology that I think could work in what we're trying to do.
I think the key for us is to be intentional about making sure we're scouring for where those opportunities exist, but we should never compromise on quality.
Okay, quickly, one other place where you do have a caveat is on data residency. You already referenced it again, despite a lot of discussion around it. So, well, best efforts. Best efforts, okay, but it's not a commitment. And I struggle a little bit in the context of a 1,500-page document where you're literally willing to move forests down to this place, create a whole new administrative infrastructure to do all of this stuff. Why isn't the position, if we don't have in Canada what you feel you need from security or redundancy perspective, we are going to make sure it gets built, because you sure are willing to create all sorts of other similar kinds of things in other aspects of this project.
A data center is a specific skill set, a specific type of people you hire, and a very expensive endeavor is kind of the short answer of that, right? It is not something where our firm, specifically Sidewalk Labs, has expertise in. I have personally never run a data center before, but I've worked with with other network engineering teams in the past. I know it's not easy, right? Is the short answer. The second answer is we want this to be portable and extensible, a lot of what we build, which means it has to be built upon existing technologies that are out there. So for example, like one of the jokes internally from an engineering perspective is we try not to build engineering infrastructure ourselves. Because we can reuse a lot of infrastructure that's already there, that's published, that's out there, whether that's Hadoop, whether that's built on top of AWS, Redfin, whether that's using Google Compute Engine and Bigtable or things like this, right? If you're using those building blocks, fundamentally you're also more extensible, but then you're also unfortunately at kind of the mercy of those companies to decide whether or not they are extending their footprint. But as I said, the reason we add that hedge is we think that's where people are moving towards, to have dual redundancy in country. And I think the reason they're doing that is not because of data residency requirements. They're doing it because of speed to customer. And so I think that generally drives that movement. And we've had discussions enough that we feel like we're confident in saying that can be achieved in the time frame of the build out.
I think you raised an interesting perspective though, which is we have a tendency to not be defeated by any circumstance. And I think what you're saying is why can't you have equal intentionality on this issue? And I think that's a very fair point. And there are obviously at the end of the day requirements have to be met, but that is food for thought for us.
Chantal, are you still on the phone, and did you have a question that you wanted to ask? Good. So can you just speak up a bit? It's a little hard to hear.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, Chantal, it's Elisa. If it's a requirement in an agreement, we're gonna live with the requirement in the agreement. Similar if it's health data or sensitive data where it has to stay here, it has to stay here. We are committed to really moving that along. We had a lot of talks with our engineering and product development team on how it would be possible and how far we would go. As Prem says, we think the trend is going to sort of make this a mood conversation, and that there will be services here by the time we develop and build that people will probably wonder why we even had the conversation. So the short answer is if the requirement is there from government, we and anyone else in Quayside will honor that requirement. No, but yeah, and I think we specifically say that's not the case. That all applicable laws would apply to the data. The only reason we separated urban data from transactional data was due to the fact that we were trying to figure out the governance structure for an urban data trust for this place, and what could reasonably be under the purview of an urban data trust. And you know, you can draw that line in many different places. But transactional data was carved out of the urban data trust, not applicable laws, it was always applied, but it was carved out of the urban data trust as an oversight body because of the nature of it and the difficulty with which we thought an urban data trust could reasonably be seen as being able to manage that. In terms of enforcement, contracting, and the mechanism through which it gets reviewed. But our foundation and the foundation for anyone in this district, public or private, will be to the laws that exist. And so if consent is needed and it applies, it will apply. Same with video surveillance. What we've done, however, is we think build upon that by making sure that the same sort of guidelines and rules of the road will apply and people will apply the same processes. As you say, companies have to be accountable already. What we're doing is making that accountability more transparent in this district by having a process that all companies have to follow. If you're a good company, you've been doing this anyway, then great. None of this should be new to you. It should be just you writing down what you already do. If you're maybe a company that didn't quite know what any of those words in the laws meant, maybe because you're small, this place will give you a roadmap and guidelines that you can apply. And so now that's how we lift all boats and make everyone subject to the same standards. That's simply what we're trying to do here. Yep.
Okay, thanks. All right, we are literally exactly the 4:45 that we had on the agenda. I recognize though that there may be other people who have some additional questions they wanted to raise, and this is, I think, the last chance we'll have to have this kind of engagement, at least for the moment, so we're trying to get into this drafting. So can we figure out some sort of process to ensure that people who do have additional questions have the ability to ask them, and hopefully you're open to respond.
Yeah, oh,
okay.
absolutely.
Okay, if you're good with that.
Yeah, we're here. So, if you want to use the time.
Let me ask this then, because we do 15 minutes. Was there anyone at any other business? Okay, so how about we go for at least another 15 minutes, and then perhaps to take us right to 5, and we'll adjourn at time. If we still don't get to some of those questions, then there'll be a way to submit those and get responses and share with others. People have additional. I know Charles has another response. I'm going to guess Andrew does too. Anybody and Mark. How about anyone else?
Just on the process part,
Yeah.
Can we do the timeline for the submission and the response? Because I know the timeline for putting it together is quite tight for August 9th.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, sure. Can we ask? Okay, if we ask people to follow up, if they haven't had a chance to ask something they wanted to ask at this meeting, or perhaps weren't even at this meeting, to get it to you, let's say by the end of this week, be able to get it.
How about tomorrow?
Well, I was going to say if we do it by the end of this week, then we can get.
We're urgent on this.
Right? We can. All right. Go on. Do it by tomorrow, that's fine.
I'm serious.
That would go.
Yeah, no, I know you are. I was actually just thinking of our own calendar. If we had it by
We're
the
drafting August 2nd.
I know, so I was hoping that they would get this
2
back
weeks.
by that date, but we can push them. We can ask to get it.
So that if you have a question, you have it in your mind, so
Fair
write
enough.
it down, send an email.
Just to be clear, that would go through you or Christina, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Mark, just for process, the question should go to Vance
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
from the panelists, and then we'll get it to Sidewalk and back.
But I mean, if people have a question, write it down, get it to Vance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Come on.
There you go. That's your process. Charles, go ahead.
It's actually picking up on a lot of bringing in a few threads. I know that it's we're asking for an innovative plan, and we're also sometimes putting it in the lens of a procurement process where have you responded to the things we've asked for, but also have you given us a bunch of new stuff that we haven't asked for. So I think that the question I would have around this is, and it's probably to help inform the comments that we may give in the evaluation process we'll go through, in the evaluation process Waterfront Toronto will go through, is there a minimal viable plan So when there's a number of things you've proposed, a number of technologies that would roll out, you proposed a number of quasi-public bodies that would have to be in place. And are there, so in terms of helping guide us through what you think are the showstoppers, the dependencies, and the most important parts of the plan, are there perhaps the follow-up plan could have some indications there that if let's say we said, well, the qual amounts are, that's a no-go, that's not going to happen, or these three bodies won't be convened in time for the plan to be rolled out, or it might be later. What is the sort of minimum set of things? Are there some, and looking at the business model you have as well, that Sidewalk Labs would say, actually, we need these 5 things to be in place for the plan to go forward. And the same thing probably Waterfront Toronto would also have to say the same thing. For us to say, what's the way forward? I don't think it's necessarily going to be a yes, no. It might be a yes with these caveats, or it might be a yes with a smaller set of scope or whatever.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. This is a question we're asking ourselves as well. I mean, the reality is we've been so focused on the work, and it has taken a lot of work to get to this, what I would define as comprehensive proposal, that we're now able to ask that kind of a question. And so I don't have an absolute answer for you right now, and it's frankly, it's not a simple question. So many things are interrelated, and there's a threshold where at some point, if there isn't enough there that reflects both the prioritization of the policy outcomes and the innovation, whether that's process, product, what material, whatever it is, there is some threshold that does define a minimum viable product for us. We're trying to answer that question for ourselves because it has to inform also a lot of how we engage moving forward with the team at Waterfront Toronto. What I can say is that maybe you used a phrase there. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about a new plan. We don't know yet exactly what materials will be important for us to provide to Waterfront Toronto, whether that's for this body or any other parts of the consultative and evaluative process. I do think we will think about how do we give some guidance on prioritization and getting to that. Let us do our homework. It's literally where we are right now in thinking through.
And I might propose that. Sorry.
I'm sorry. And one other thing I would add is you mentioned about we named 5 entities. We tried to say here's a comprehensive proposal for how to achieve these things, fully knowing that there may be any of a number of alternative strategies to get to those same outcomes. And so I don't think about it as like we must have 5 entities. I think about if that's not the path, what's the alternative path to get to the outcome that is enabling and contributing to. And so it's a bit of a dynamic question to sort of think through how to get there.
I was going to say, I might propose part of the answer might be in some of the things we talked about. It's actually the methodologies and the iterative process that is actually where a lot of the value is. So,
agreed.
Andrew? Yeah. So I'll preface by saying I have already prepared a set of questions on a Google Doc that I've shared. So that can be handed over fairly quickly, and presumably people can add to that. So I just sort of offer that as a helpful way of proceeding. So I guess my question has to do with the relationship between Sidewalk Labs and other Alphabet subsidiaries. And you all well know that the controversies around Sidewalk Labs have in many ways revolved around the data-driven business models of Google and other subsidiaries, where it's based on monetizing personal information. And you have responded, I think, by making clear that you are not part of Google. You operate on a very different business model. You will not sell personal information nor use it for advertising. But I would like some sort of transparency about how you will be relating with other Alphabet subsidiaries that do operate on those models. So the first question I would ask is, what other Alphabet subsidiaries do you contemplate playing a part in B-Side? And secondarily, will you commit to keeping any of other such personal data-driven subsidiaries at arm's length from everything that you do, including your own outdoor advertising arm, Intersection, which is a outdoor display company that uses data-driven models, personal data-driven models for advertising. And so how can we, if you do to make that, how will we know that arm's length relationship is being maintained? So there's a bunch of questions.
Understood. So let me take a first shot, and then if I miss anything, Lisa,
sure.
you add on. First, I just want to make sure we're very clear. We have no obligation, requirement, expectation, or anything else that our business needs to utilize or in any way tap into or have a relationship with any other subsidiary of Alphabet, Google included. So there is nothing about our business model that requires that in any way. There's nothing about our governance that in any way expects or requires that. Secondly, I would say anything we do is going to be subject to the same process and principles and governance on data and all of the various pieces of that, whether it's us in some form of partnership with a different Alphabet subsidiary, whether it's us in partnership with somebody who has nothing to do with Alphabet. So there is no expectation of anything being different in any way for the process for that. In terms of where there are opportunities to leverage what the works of any of the other Alphabet subsidiaries, I would ask Prem and Elisa to comment on this. From my perspective, there may be a handful. Is it possible that there's some potential collaboration with a Waymo over time? Maybe. There is nothing right now that says that we have to or that we have plans for. Is there, we do some work with, for example, within Google, their real estate function, because sometimes we have shared interest in figuring out very specific solutions. So there's opportunities like that. But we don't have an inventory of sort of here's all the ways that we expect to or anticipate it. And same holds true for Intersection, who you referenced, which, Elisa, you'll get right, the exact legal relationship we have with Intersection, but there is no, at this point, plan for the integration of what they do, and if there were to be subject to all the same process and policies and governance as anything else. Elisa, did I?
No, that's right. Yeah, Intersection is an investment. We just have a minority investment in it, like City Block. You might have seen that at Ford. So it's just a portfolio company. As Josh said, to the extent that any of those entities, just like any other entity, wants to come into the district and use urban data, they would be subject to the same rules. The Urban Data Trust, the Responsible Data Use Guidelines, they'd have to do an RDUSA assessment to justify whatever collection and use of data that they want to have and be subject to the same approvals or denial by the Urban Data Trust if they have not proved out that they are doing things in the public interest in a privacy preserving way. So no different from any other Google entity.
Yeah. I mean, but the sorry, go ahead.
Got it. I think we're 3 minutes left. So okay. Say we got a long list. So
yeah.
Mark, do you have
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. So, as I was walking through the MIDIP that I've gotten mostly through, I encountered quite a number of software solutions that I didn't see in the final list on the end in the digital section. So I've probably forgotten some, but there's a digital fabrication software system for the wood. There's a digital housing affordable housing application process. There's an application called Perform. It's a software product to enforce energy targets. There's utility bill development, and inside thermal grid, power grid, and digital delivery, there's all kinds of software. So I get to the end and I say, these are the proposed services, and I don't see that rather lengthy list. So I'm curious why.
So the list of the services that are in the digital innovation chapter are the proposed services that Sidewalk Labs is proposing it would do. There's, as you mentioned a lot of other services that would be done, we would think, more so through third parties, and that's that's really part of the proposition here as well, and how we
So-
talk about the ecosystem, yeah.
Yeah, so what I think might be helpful is to add that list as sort of a comprehensive list, both of the sidewalk labs proposed and the
See that?
things that you would either propose to RFP or develop in collaboration with or whatever, so that people get a full list of all of the digital services that are going to be in here and a clear sense of what sidewalk proposes to do.
I add my usual footnote or caveat to that, which is that we can do that for what's written today, with the knowledge that as we build out, we'll learn more.
Yeah, no, and that's fine, but I mean, that's as of, all of this is as of today, this is what you see, and some of those services may disappear, some new services may appear, all of that's.
It comes back to the process
all
on
of
an
that's
ongoing
fine.
basis.
All of that's fine, but just as a snapshot of where we are today, it'd be good to get that single comprehensive view.
Got it.
Alright, and with that, it's 4:59. So thank you very much for coming in and responding to all of our questions today. I think it's really helpful as part of our deliberative process. Thanks for the presentation we have from Ontario as well. And can I get a motion to adjourn?